Before we delve into the peculiar twilight world of our next tale, a gentle reminder to unfurl your cloaks and perhaps click the subscribe button for more stories that promise to mildly distract your midnight wanderings. Now, dim the lights and prepare for a narrative that, while perhaps not entirely sleep-inducing, will certainly offer a different kind of quietude. The unfortunate Fangs, Count Vladislav Dracul, a name that once caused the most stalwart of men to stammer and the bravest of women to faint, now found himself contemplating the rather unvampiric agony of a relentless mauler. For centuries, his very existence had been synonymous with dread. His shadow a harbinger of icy fear, his gaze a promise of oblivion. He had traversed the dimly lit cobblestones of various epochs, an undisputed apex predator of the night, feared and occasionally worshipped for his swift, silent, and utterly lethal prowess. His fangs, those elegant razor-sharp extensions of his very being, were the jewels in his macabre crown, the instruments of his perpetual sustenance, the very definition of his terrifying allure. They were, in essence, the pride of his undead existence, polished to a gleam by an instinctual habit that was as old as the crumbling foundations of his ancestral castle. But now, those very fangs, or rather the root of the fang, that anchored his left upper canine, had become his greatest, most excruciating curse. The pain had begun subtly, a mere phantom ache, a whisper of discomfort Vladislav had initially dismissed as a minor irritation, perhaps a lingering echo from a particularly resistant peasant, or perhaps the subtle protest of an ancient, unoiled joint. He had sipped his customary draught of lukewarm, aged claret, a poor substitute for the vital, pulsating crimson he craved, and merely grumbled. But whispers have a way of escalating into shouts, and within a fortnight that phantom ache had blossomed into a full-blown, throbbing symphony of torment, a relentless, gnawing tempest of agony that had taken up residence in the very core of his left upper canine, pulsating with a malevolent rhythm that mocked his immortality. It was an indignity, a preposterous, unholy affront to his ancient, formidable status. How could the creature of legend, the bane of Transylvanian villagers, be brought to his knees by something so utterly mundane as a toothache? It was the sort of pathetic irony that even a jaded, 500-year-old vampire found difficult to swallow, especially when swallowing anything at all. Even his own copious internal complaints sent a searing bolt of pain directly into his brain. His vast, echoing castle, once a fortress of silent power, had become a mausoleum of misery. Every creak of the old timbers, every gust of wind whistling through the ill-fitting casements, every distant hoot of an owl seemed to amplify the internal throbbing, transforming the quiet solitude into a cacophony of agony. Sleep, that blessed temporary oblivion, had abandoned him entirely. For weeks he had paced the immense, dust-laden galleries of his ancestral home, a shadow of his former terrifying self. His posture, once erect and imposing, was now perpetually hunched, one clawed hand pressed firmly against his throbbing jaw, as if he could physically suppress the insurrection within his very bone. His crimson velvet dressing gown, once so immaculately draped, hung askew, its rich fabric dulled by days of neglect, mirroring the dull ache that permeated his very soul. His eyes, typically piercing and alight with a predatory gleam, were now bloodshot, shadowed by sleepless nights spent in a purgatory of pain, their usual predatory fire replaced by a perpetually bewildered and resentful glaze. The irony of his predicament was not lost on him, though he found no humor in it. A vampire, the quintessential blood drinker, rendered incapable of performing his most fundamental act. The very thought of sinking his fangs, even the good ones, into anything, let alone a throbbing carotid artery, sent shivers of preemptive pain down his ancient spine. The mere mention of sustenance, The faintest whiff of a passing badger, unfortunate enough to wander into the castle grounds, caused his sensitive fangs to throb with a renewed vengeance. He had tried everything within the limits of his archaic knowledge. He had applied poultices of garlic, ironically a substance he abhorred, mixed with various questionable herbs harvested from the overgrown castle gardens, their efficacy roughly equivalent to a lullaby sung by a screech owl. He had held lumps of ice, chipped from the perpetually cold stone walls of his dungeon, against his cheek until his skin was numb and blotchy, only for the searing pain to return the moment the chill subsided. He had even, in a moment of desperate delusion, attempted to draw the tooth himself with a pair of ancient, rusty blacksmith's pliers he'd found in a forgotten armory, only to shriek in a manner most unbecoming of a vampire lord, nearly dropping the pliers and sending an entire suit of armor clattering to the flagstones. The sheer humiliation of that moment, the vision of himself, the great Count Dracul, reduced to such a pathetic display, burned almost as brightly as the nerve in his tooth. His long-suffering, equally ancient bat familiars, normally circling his towers with graceful precision, now merely perched on the highest turrets, observing his tormented pacing with a mixture of detached pity and mild annoyance. Even they seemed to recognize the shift in the castle's atmosphere, the palpable aura of dental distress that now clung to every stone. The rats, usually scurrying through the lower levels in a constant nervous scurry, had grown bolder, sensing the vampire's weakness, their tiny eyes gleaming with a new, unsettling confidence. Vladislav no longer bothered to swat at them. The effort was too great, the consequence of jarring his jaw too dire. He simply moved around them, a ghostly figure haunted not by the spirits of his victims, but by the relentless ache of a single, betraying tooth. He remembered a time, long ago, perhaps in the late 17th century, when his fangs were perfect instruments of his will. He had once engaged in a particularly spirited duel with a rather plump and surprisingly agile werewolf, a regrettable incident involving a miscalculated moon phase. During the fracas, one of his fangs had taken a glancing blow against the werewolf's impressively thick skull. Yet it had remained steadfast, unwavering, a testament to its formidable strength. Now that same fabled strength seemed to have turned inward, creating an unyielding, internal pressure that threatened to splinter his very sanity. The thought of seeking mortal aid for such an unholy malady was an anathema, a profound indignity that sent shivers of revulsion through his immortal form. A human dentist? The very idea was preposterous beneath him. But the pain, oh the pain! It gnawed his resolve, chipped away at his ancient pride, and whispered insidious suggestions of desperation into his throbbing mind. He, Vladislav Dracul, reduced to such contemplation. It was almost enough to make him wish for the merciful release of a wooden stake, if only the thought of anything sharp piercing his body didn't send another spasm of agony through his beleaguered jaw. His existence, once an endless tapestry of nocturnal conquest and chilling silence, had devolved into a repetitive cycle of clenching, moaning, and applying tepid, useless compresses. The moonlight, once a welcome companion to his hunts, now seemed only to illuminate his suffering, casting long gaunt shadows that danced mockingly around his agonizing form as he shuffled through his vast, lonely halls, clutching his jaw, an immortal creature brought low by the most stubbornly mortal of afflictions. Chapter 2. A visit to the medieval dentist, the relentless gnawing in Count Vladislav's jaw, had finally shattered the last brittle shards of his ancient pride. The agony, a malevolent entity pulsating behind his eye, had surpassed the mere inconvenience of an immortal affliction and evolved into a profound, soul-crushing torment. He had tried everything within the dark, arcane confines of his castle, from poultices of nightshade and hemlock, which only served to irritate his already inflamed gums, to incantations whispered over lukewarm blood, a ritual he now realized was utterly futile against the stubborn biological rebellion of a root. His desperate, solitary experiments had only cemented one terrifying, humiliating truth. He needed assistance. And not just any assistance. He needed a mortal. A human. A dentist. The very word tasted of ash and defeat. A bitter potion far worse than any concoction he had ever forced down a victim's throat. Disguise was paramount. To be recognized, the mighty Dracul, stumbling through a provincial town with a swollen cheek and a grimace that owed nothing to ferocity and everything to a dying nerve, would be an unimaginable disgrace. So, under the cloak of a moonless night, cloaked in a heavy, nondescript traveler's mantle that obscured his aristocratic bearing, and with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to conceal the telltale glow of his immortal eyes, he slipped from his castle gates. His journey was a slow, agonizing shuffle, each jostle of the cobbled road sending a fresh jolt of agony through his jaw. He sought not the grand, bustling metropolises, but a small, forgotten village, hoping that its obscurity would offer a measure of anonymity, and perhaps a practitioner whose incompetence was matched only by their desperation for coin. He found such a place, a hamlet clinging precariously to the edge of the Carpathian foothills, its houses huddled together like frightened sheep. The sign, creaking mournfully in the frigid night breeze, read Master Elara, Barber, Surgeon, and Tooth Drawer. It was painted crudely, the letters smeared, and beneath it hung a string of withered teeth, yellowed and grim, swinging like morbid wind chimes. The establishment itself was a ramshackle affair, leaning precariously against its neighbor, its windows emitting a dim, flickering light that promised little in the way of hygiene or comfort. The air was thick with the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, stale ale, something vaguely medicinal that hinted more at decay than healing. Vladislav hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to flee, to embrace the sweet release of a stake rather than submit to this indignity. But the throbbing in his jaw, a constant malevolent drumbeat, overruled his ancient sensibilities. He pushed open the warped wooden door, which groaned in protest like a dying beast. Inside, the scene was even more dismal than anticipated. A single tallow candle guttered on a rickety table, casting dancing shadows that made the cramped room seem even more confined. Scattered across various surfaces were an assortment of rusted implements, their purpose unsettlingly vague. A pair of enormous pitted pliers that looked as if they belonged in a blacksmith's forge. A bowl filled with dubious-looking leeches wriggling with an unsettling enthusiasm, and various glass vials containing liquids of opaque and alarming colors. The air was heavy with the stench of human misery and bad breath. Behind the table, hunched over a simmering pot, was Master Elara, a man whose appearance did little to inspire confidence. He was corpulent, with a perpetually stained apron, a scraggly beard that seemed to defy all attempts at grooming, and eyes that held a peculiar mix of weariness and predatory glee. Next, Master Elara bellowed, his voice raspy, barely glancing up from his bubbling concoction. Vladislav, still clutching his jaw, approached the table with a theatrical stoop, trying to appear as decrepit and harmless as possible. He muttered a vague complaint about a terrible pain and pointed a trembling finger at his swollen cheek. Elara grunted, wiping his greasy hands on his equally greasy apron. Aye, the toothache. A common affliction. Most unnatural, though. Likely a demon in the jawbone, or perhaps bad humors. Let us see. He motioned Vladislav to a rickety stool. Open wide, good sir. Vladislav recoiled instinctively, opening his mouth, exposing his fangs, even his ailing one, to mortal eyes. The thought was an abomination. But the pain, always the pain, forced his reluctant compliance. He opened his mouth only slightly, trying to conceal the full extent of his dental glory. Elara, however, was not one for subtlety. He grabbed Vladislav's chin with a surprisingly strong grip, forcing his jaw wide with a loud pop that sent a searing bolt of agony straight through Vladislav's skull. Vladislav bit back a shriek, his eyes watering. Elara peered into Vladislav's mouth, his breath warm and redolent of pickled onions. He poked and prodded with a long, rusty probe that looked suspiciously like a modified knitting needle. Each poke sent a fresh wave of blinding pain through the vampire's nervous system. Yes, a rather large canine, this one," Elara mumbled, quite oblivious to the uniqueness of the tooth in question. "And the most unfortunate swelling. Deep within the root, I'd wager. A clear case of putrid humors. Or perhaps a worm." He straightened up, his eyes gleaming with a disconcerting intensity. "Fear not, good sir. Master Elara has remedies for all such earthly woes." Vladislav's internal monologue screamed in protest. Worms? Putrid humors? This was the cutting edge of human medicine? He longed for the days of impalement. At least that had a certain gruesome efficiency. "First," Elara declared, reaching for a jar of wriggling black creatures, "we must draw out the bad blood. Leeches. Nature's own phlebotomists." He extended a plump, surprisingly eager leech towards Vladislav's throbbing cheek. "3 of these plump fellows should do the trick. They'll drain the offending humors, you see. A most soothing treatment." Vladislav stared at the leech, then at Elara, then back at the leech. A vampire who drained the living was now to be drained by a common garden-variety annelid. The indignity was monumental. His entire undead existence was a cosmic jest, it seemed. He considered transforming into a bat and flying out the window, but the pain had dulled his abilities, and besides, the ceiling was too low. Perhaps Vladislav rasped, forcing a polite tone through gritted teeth. "Something a little less lively." Elara scoffed. "Nonsense. Leeches are the essence of the cure. But if you insist on alternatives, I have others." He rummaged through a collection of small, dirt-encrusted sacks. "Ah, here we are, a most potent poultice. Garlic mixed with crushed nightshade berries and a dash of ground wolfsbane. Applied directly to the gum. It will draw out the evil." Vladislav's immortal senses reeled. Garlic? The bane of his existence, the very substance that caused him to shrivel, to recoil in agony, was being offered as a remedy? The universe was clearly laughing at him. The thought of applying the pungent, noxious paste to his already inflamed gum, so close to the offending Fang, sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. It was a torture more insidious than any silver bullet. "Garlic?" he choked, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you quite certain?" "Master Elara?" "Certain as the moon follows the sun." Elara boomed, completely misunderstanding the vampire's horror. "A most venerable cure for tooth ailments. Cleanses the spirit as well, they say. Very good for the humors. And it deters the little tooth demons if you believe in such things. Though I prefer to think it's the humors." He scooped a dollop of the vile, greenish-brown paste onto a grubby finger, moving towards Vladislav's face with alarming speed. Vladislav involuntarily recoiled, his instincts shrieking a silent warning. He imagined the searing sensation of the garlic on his delicate, undead flesh, the excruciating pain, the inevitable shriveling. It would be a slow, torturous demise. Not by stake or sunlight, but by cloves of garlic. "No, wait," he managed, pushing Elara's hand away with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. The motion sent a fresh, blinding flash of pain through his jaw, momentarily distracting him from the garlic-induced horror. Elara blinked, momentarily taken aback. "A sensitive constitution, are we?" "Very well, very well. Perhaps a different approach, then. We could try a vigorous bloodletting from the arm, to balance the humors throughout the body. Or a strong purgative to expel the evil humors from the bowels, which often affect the teeth, you see. Or, for a truly stubborn case..." Elara's eyes narrowed, and he picked up the formidable pliers from the table, testing their weight. "We could simply remove the offending member, swiftly, painlessly, or at least as painlessly as these things usually go. He gave a chilling, toothless grin. Vladislav stared at the pliers, then at the cheerful, unhinged barber surgeon. The sheer barbarity of the suggestion, the crude, unhygienic implements, the certainty that such a procedure would leave him maimed and infected, filled him with a cold dread that rivaled even the thought of eternal sleep. He imagined the splintering bone, the tearing flesh, the agonizing crunch as his precious fang, however troublesome, was ripped from its socket by this brute. It was a horrifying vision, far worse than any of his centuries of nightmares. He pictured his magnificent, once terrifying fangs, now broken, chipped, or entirely absent, leaving him a gumming, pathetic caricature of his former self. The very thought was an absolute desecration. The combination of the garlic, the leeches, and the utterly terrifying prospect of an impromptu, medieval tooth extraction by an unwashed charlatan sent a fresh, desperate wave of despair through the vampire. His jaw throbbed, his stomach churned, and his ancient heart, typically a cold, unmoving organ, felt a pang of something akin to terror. He had faced crusaders, werewolves, and zealous witch hunters, but never had he felt so utterly vulnerable, so pathetically at the mercy of forces so utterly mundane, and yet so devastatingly effective in their absurdity. The promise of a cure seemed to recede further with each of Ilara's pronouncements. His condition, far from improving, had only worsened, if only by the sheer mental anguish of contemplating such horrifyingly inadequate cures. He stood there, a being of immense power, reduced to a quivering, pain-racked wretch, staring at a jar of leeches and a man with questionable hygiene and even more questionable medical practices. The night, once his domain, had become a canvas for his excruciating dental drama, and the world seemed to conspire against his immortal constitution, all because of a single, infuriatingly persistent ache. He paid Master Ilara a handful of tarnished coins, mostly out of a desperate hope that some invisible, sympathetic magic might still be at play, and retreated into the night, the garlic-laden air of the barber's shop clinging to his cloak, a phantom menace more terrifying than any phantom ache. The street outside offered no solace, only the chilling reality that his suffering was far from over. Chapter 3. The failed hunt. The encounter with Master Ilara, the barber surgeon of dubious skill and even more dubious hygiene, had left Count Vladislav Dracul not only still plagued by the unyielding torment of his inflamed fang, but also profoundly, existentially humiliated. The very air of the wretched village, clinging to his cloaks with the faint, persistent stench of garlic and medicinal grime, felt like a personal insult. He had fled that hovel of human quackery under the protective shroud of the pre-dawn darkness, his mind reeling from the absurd propositions of leeches and, most horrifyingly, the direct application of garlic. His ancient pride, already chipped and fractured by weeks of ceaseless pain, had shattered into 1,000 unseen pieces. He, the terror of the Carpathians, had been reduced to recoiling from a human hand, clutching a paste that smelled of his very undoing. The ignominy was almost as sharp as the phantom drills Ilara had seemed to wield with his very gaze. Now, as the true night descended, cloaking the world in a velvety darkness that once offered him solace and dominion, Vladislav felt a different kind of gnawing. The hunger. It was a cold, empty ache in his immortal gut, a stark counterpoint to the pulsating inferno in his jaw. For what felt like an eternity, he had subsisted on the most meager, unfulfilling substitutes, the dusty, forgotten bottles of ancient claret offering only a fleeting illusion of sustenance. His body, though undead, still craved the vibrant, life-giving essence of fresh blood, a yearning that was as fundamental to his being as the very shadows he commanded. The thought of it, the rich, metallic tang, the warmth, sent a shiver through him that was both longing and dread. How could he feed when the instruments of his very nature, his magnificent fangs, had betrayed him so utterly. He prowled the desolate forest trails bordering his domain, a gaunt, restless wraith. His movements, usually fluid and silent as a wisp of mist, were now punctuated by slight, involuntary grimaces and the careful, almost geriatric tilt of his head to avoid jarring his afflicted jaw. The predatory gleam in his eyes, once a fearsome beacon in the darkest night, was now largely obscured by a perpetual squint of discomfort. He resembled less a creature of nightmare, and more a very old, very unwell man attempting to navigate treacherous terrain in the dark. The usual vibrant symphony of the nocturnal forest, the rustling of unseen creatures, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint scuttling of rodents seemed muted, almost mocking in its indifferent vitality. Then he saw it. A flickering lantern bobbing rhythmically in the distance, cutting a lonely path through the oppressive darkness of the woods. A human. Late. Alone. A peasant, most likely, returning from some distant market or an illicit tryst. A prime target. Exactly the sort of oblivious, self-important morsel he would have dispatched with effortless precision in his prime. A surge of his primordial hunger, momentarily eclipsing the dental agony, coursed through him. This was it. This was his chance to reassert his dominance, to silence the clamoring emptiness within him, to remind himself of who, or rather what, he truly was. He moved, or attempted to move, with his accustomed stealth. But the weeks of sleepless torment, the inadequate sustenance, and the sheer relentless throbbing in his jaw had taken their toll. His usual approach, a whisper of shadow that preceded a swift, fatal strike, was clumsy. He misjudged a route, stumbled slightly, stifling a pained grunt as a jolt went through his skull. The lantern, held by its unsuspecting bearer, wavered. The peasant, a man of stout build and unassuming demeanor, turned, his face illuminated briefly by the sputtering light. He was not young, his face weathered by sun and toil, but he possessed an aura of quiet resilience, of one accustomed to the hardships of life, but not necessarily its terrors. Vladislav, recovering his footing, launched himself forward. It was meant to be the classic predatory lunge, swift, silent, overwhelming. His hand clamped over the peasant's mouth, silencing any potential cry, his other arm wrapping around the man's stout frame, drawing him close for the fatal bite. His heart, or what passed for one, hammered with a desperate ancient rhythm. He felt the peasant's surprisingly muscular neck beneath his grasp, the steady, rhythmic pulse of life, thrumming tantalizingly close. This was it, the moment of truth. He leaned in, his mouth open, fangs extending, ready to plunge into the warm, vital artery. But as his upper left canine, the offending tooth, neared the peasant's skin, a searing, blinding, white-hot bolt of pain erupted from its very root. It was as if a blacksmith had driven a glowing poker directly into his jawbone. His vision swam. Tears or something akin to them welled in his bloodshot eyes, and a guttural, involuntary moan escaped his lips, muffled only slightly by the hand still clamped over the peasant's mouth. His fangs, instead of piercing, merely scraped clumsily across the peasant's thick woolen tunic, producing a faint, almost comedic whoopik sound. The intended lethal bite became a pathetic, toothless gnawing at fabric. The peasant, who had initially tensed, bracing for an unseen blow, seemed utterly bewildered. He felt the grip on his arm slacken slightly, the hand over his mouth trembling. He heard the strange, pained whimper. He could smell the odd, faintly unwashed scent of the assailant, mixed with something else. Something metallic? He squinted through the gloom, trying to make out the features of his attacker, who seemed to be doing a rather poor job of attacking. Vladislav recoiled, clutching his jaw with both hands, his face contorted in an expression of pure, unadulterated agony. The hunt, the glorious, instinctual act of his very being, had been utterly, catastrophically botched. He hadn't even broken the skin. He had merely rubbed against it. He, Vladislav Dracul, the Impaler, the Lord of the Night, had become a clumsy, whimpering nuisance. The peasant, now entirely unfettered, lowered his lantern, its feeble light illuminating Vladislav's contorted, desperate face. He saw not the snarling visage of a demon, but the strained, gaunt features of a man, or something vaguely human-shaped, in considerable distress. The vampire's eyes, though undeniably unsettling in their intensity, seemed to hold more pain than malice. The peasant, a simple man named Bogdan, who was well acquainted with various forms of human suffering, recognized the universal language of affliction. He took a step back, not in terror, but in hesitant confusion. "Bless my soul, good sir," Bogdan mumbled, scratching his head. "Are you quite all right? You look unwell. Did you perchance trip? Or perhaps a sudden cramp?" He gestured vaguely at Vladislav's jaw, still clutched in a desperate vice. "Is it your tooth, perchance? My old granny suffered something terrible with her molars. Kept her awake for nights." "It did." Vladislav stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. This was not the terrified shriek, the frantic plea for mercy, the primal fear that was his due. This was concern. Pity, even. The peasant was looking at him with the same sort of commiseration one might offer a stray dog that had barked itself hoarse. It was an insult so profound, so utterly unexpected, that it temporarily eclipsed even the throbbing in his jaw. I am perfectly fine," Vladislav rasped, attempting to regain some semblance of his terrifying persona, but his voice was thin, reedy, laced with residual pain. He tried to glare, but his eyes merely watered. Bogdan, seemingly oblivious to the aura of ancient malevolence that should have emanated from Vladislav, merely clucked sympathetically. "Nonsense, good sir, you look green around the gills. And your grip. Light as a feather, it was. You need something for that pain. Perhaps a bit of something to eat. My granny always said a good apple settled the stomach and eased the mind." And then, with an astonishing lack of self-preservation, Bogdan reached into the worn satchel slung over his shoulder. Vladislav watched, mesmerized, half expecting a crucifix or a sharpened stake to emerge. Instead, Bogdan produced a large, plump, crimson apple, polished to a dull sheen by its journey in the satchel. He held it out, a gesture of pure, unadulterated human kindness. "Here," Bogdan said, offering the fruit. "A good, crisp apple, fresh from the orchard, picked this very morn. Take it. It might just cheer you up. And it's good for the teeth, they say. Keeps the doctor away. If you can afford one." He smiled, a genuine, if slightly bewildered, smile. Vladislav stared at the apple. It was round, solid, utterly alien in its wholesome simplicity. An apple. For him. A vampire offered an apple. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, far more pungent than the residual garlic from Master Alara's shop. How was he to bite into an apple? The very thought of sinking his teeth, even his good teeth, into something so unyielding, so crunchy, sent a fresh wave of preemptive agony through his jaw. His entire existence revolved around the piercing of soft flesh, the drawing of warm liquids. An apple was an impenetrable fortress, a cruel jest. He remained frozen, his arms still instinctively cradling his jaw, his eyes fixed on the innocuous fruit. The peasant, Bogdan, still holding out the apple, shifted his weight patiently. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic internal screaming of Count Vladislav Dracul. The hunger still gnawed, but the shame, the sheer, unutterable humiliation of this moment, eclipsed it. He, the ancient predator, reduced to this pitiable spectacle. The vampire who couldn't bite offered a sympathy apple. It was a tableau of cosmic absurdity, a mockery of centuries of terror. He turned a silent, spectral figure. and melted back into the shadows of the forest, leaving the bewildered peasant holding his lantern and a perfectly good apple, wondering if he had just encountered a very ill traveler, or perhaps a particularly clumsy ghost. The apple remained uneaten, a symbol of his current lamentable plight, and his stomach remained hollow, a testament to his crippling, most unvampiric affliction. Chapter 4. The mockery of the Coven, the lingering chill of the forest night, seemed to seep into Count Vladislav Dracul's very bones as he retreated from the bewildering encounter with Bogdan, the apple-offering peasant. The memory of the man's bewildered pity, his naive concern for Vladislav's unwellness, burned hotter than any stake. He, Vladislav Dracul, the undisputed sovereign of shadow, had been reduced to an object of human sympathy. A frail, stumbling wretch too infirm to even perform the most basic, instinctual act of his vampiric nature. The humiliation was a deeper, more insidious pain than even the ceaseless throb in his jaw, and that was saying a great deal, considering the throbbing had now escalated into a relentless, skull-splitting migraine that felt like 1,000 tiny blacksmiths hammering away at his very brain. He stumbled back through his castle gates, a phantom of his former, terrifying self, his cloak dragging in the dust, his regal posture utterly abandoned for a defeated slouch. The rats in the courtyard no longer scurried away. Some even seemed to pause, their beady eyes glinting with an unnerving, almost curious insolence, as if they too sensed the profound shift in the castle's ancient hierarchy. His coven, his eternal companions in darkness, a collection of lesser vampires and thralls he had sired and commanded for centuries, had long been paragons of unwavering loyalty and abject fear. They were creatures whose very existence hinged upon his strength, his predatory might, his ability to sustain them and guide them through the treacherous dance of immortality. They had worshipped his power, cowered before his wrath, and obeyed his every unspoken command, their faces typically masks of respectful deference. But as Vladislav entered the great hall, a place once reserved for solemn pronouncements and the occasional swift punishment of a transgressor, an unsettling silence descended. It was not the reverent hush of awe, but a pregnant, waiting quietude, tinged with something he had not encountered from them in centuries, an almost palpable sense of ill-concealed amusement. They were gathered, a dozen or so of his most ancient and trusted, or so he had once believed, vampires. There was Lady Katerina, whose porcelain features usually held an expression of exquisite boredom, but whose eyes now sparkled with a disturbing, almost gleeful malice. Beside her stood Lord Grigor, a hulking brute of a vampire, who traditionally spoke only in grunts, but whose lips now curved into a slow, unsettling smirk. Even the usually stoic Elder Victor, whose wisdom had guided the Coven through countless mortal wars and plagues, had a faint, almost imperceptible tremor at the corner of his mouth, as if suppressing a laugh. They were not cowering. They were not even standing respectfully. They were lounging, some draped languidly over the ancient, dust-shrouded furniture, others leaning against the tapestried walls, their eyes fixed on him, not with fear, but with an unsettling blend of curiosity and outright contempt. The air, usually thick with the scent of old blood and the faint metallic tang of their eternal existence, was now oddly devoid of such familiar comforts. Instead, there was a faint earthy aroma, strangely reminiscent of root vegetables. "Ah, our lord returns," Lady Katerina purred, her voice dripping with an exaggerated sweetness that was far more cutting than any insult. She unfolded herself from a chaise lounge with a languid grace that mocked his own stiff-pained movements. We were beginning to fret. The night is so full of challenges, is it not? Especially for those with delicate constitutions. Her gaze flickered pointedly to his jaw, still clutched defensively by his clawed hand. Vladislav felt a flush of impotent rage, a heat that could not even begin to compete with the searing pain in his tooth. He tried to project his usual aura of terrifying menace, to silence them with a single withering glare. But the effort only sent a fresh jolt of agony through his inflamed nerve. His eyes, instead of blazing with fury, merely watered with discomfort. "What is the meaning of this insolence?" he rasped, his voice rougher than he intended, more a pained whisper than a commanding growl. "Why are you all gathered like this? And what is that peculiar aroma?" Lord Grigor finally chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that quickly spread through the assembled coven. "Meaning, my lord?" he rumbled, his voice laced with an uncharacteristic sarcasm. "Why, we merely thought to honor your recent struggles. A celebration of sorts. A testament to your resilience in the face of adversity." He swept a hand towards a long, oaken table in the center of the hall, previously obscured by the shadows. Vladislav's gaze followed Grigor's gesture, and his immortal blood ran cold. The table, usually laden with the spoils of their nocturnal hunts, with goblets overflowing with the rich, dark sustenance they craved, was indeed set. But it was a setting of cruel parody. Instead of the gleaming silver and crystal that usually adorned their feasts, there were tarnished pewter plates and chipped, cloudy glasses. And in each glass, instead of the deep, shimmering crimson of fresh blood, or even the respectable burgundy of ancient wine, sat a pale, translucent, yellowish liquid. It looked suspiciously like water. Or worse. "Behold, my lord," Lady Katarina announced, a theatrical flourish of her hand accompanying her words. I bloodless feasting. In your honor, of course. For your new dietary considerations." Her eyes gleamed with malicious amusement. "We understand that certain activities have become rather difficult for you of late. And so, we have prepared a repast suitable for one whose fangs are otherwise engaged." Elder Victor, his face a careful mask of faux solemnity, stepped forward, holding aloft a large earthenware pitcher. "We call this the nectar of the earth," he intoned, his voice strangely devoid of his usual gravitas. "Freshly pressed from the finest, most fibrous turnips cultivated in the valleys below, rich in nutrients, we are told, and, most importantly, utterly devoid of any challenging textures. Turnip juice." Vladislav stared at the pale, viscous liquid in the glasses, then at the pitcher in Victor's hand. Turnip juice. This was the ultimate insult. His coven, his progeny, his eternal subjects, were not only acknowledging his crippling weakness, but were actively mocking it, celebrating his downfall with the very antithesis of their existence. It was a cosmic jest of such profound cruelty that it momentarily eclipsed even the hammering in his jaw. A vampire who lived on blood was being offered the distilled essence of a root vegetable. "And we made sure," Lord Grigor added, stepping closer, his voice a low, taunting rumble, "that there were no sharp bits, no bones, nothing that might aggravate your tender condition. Not a single challenging fragment." He picked up one of the chipped glasses and offered it to Vladislav, his massive hand trembling slightly with suppressed laughter. The yellowish liquid sloshed within, its faint earthy aroma assaulting Vladislav's heightened senses. The vampire's mind raced, a whirlwind of rage, despair, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. He wanted to lash out, to rip them limb from limb, to show them the true meaning of his wrath, even with a throbbing tooth. But the pain, that malevolent entity residing in his jaw, was a relentless jailer. Every flicker of anger, every surge of adrenaline, sent a fresh, searing bolt through his skull, threatening to incapacitate him entirely. He couldn't even summon the energy for a truly terrifying snarl. It would only worsen the unbearable pressure in his jaw. He could feel the eyes of the entire coven on him, expectant, waiting for him to break, to confirm their suspicions of his utter impotence. With a superhuman effort, Vladislav took the glass from Grigor. His fingers, usually so strong, trembled almost imperceptibly. He brought the glass to his lips, the faint, vegetative scent an affront to his very nature. He watched, through bloodshot, pain-filled eyes, as the Coven members watched him, their expressions a mixture of feigned sympathy and thinly veiled delight. He imagined the taste, bland, earthy, utterly devoid of the warmth and vitality he craved. And then there was the texture, that pulpy, fibrous quality that would surely get caught in the tender, inflamed spaces around his wretched Fang. He raised the glass, hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, then forced a small, almost imperceptible sip. The turnip juice was precisely as he imagined. Thin, watery, with a faint, cloying sweetness and an overwhelming earthiness that coated his tongue like mud. It was an anti-nourishment, a void. His stomach, accustomed to the rich, complex flavors of blood, churned in protest. He could feel the slight grit of tiny turnip fibers, and the faint scraping sensation against his gums sent a fresh wave of nausea through him, entirely unrelated to the taste. "Exquisite, is it not, my lord?" Lady Katerina cooed, taking a dainty sip from her own glass, though Vladislav noted she quickly grimaced, the effort clearly for show. "So earthy, so wholesome. A perfect tonic for one's delicate constitution." Vladislav merely nodded, a stiff, almost imperceptible movement. His jaw clenched tight to prevent any tremor of pain from showing. He tried to swallow the meager sip, but his throat felt constricted, and the effort sent a dull ache radiating from his jaw up into his temporal bone. He longed for a swift, lethal blow, for the glorious violence of a true confrontation, anything to distract from this slow, agonizing dissolution of his power and dignity. He was a lion, trapped in a cage, being prodded by mice, and the mice were wearing velvet. "We heard rumors, my lord," Elder Victor continued, his eyes betraying a hint of genuine curiosity beneath the veneer of mockery, "of your recent encounters. A peasant, we were told, offering an apple. One wonders what new forms of sustenance you are exploring. Perhaps a return to the soil from which we all sprang." His voice was even, but the implication was devastating. The Coven knew. They knew of his pathetic failure. The story of the apple, of Bogdan's bizarre sympathy, had somehow already spread, turning his deepest humiliation into a grotesque jest among his own kind. The sheer, unadulterated shame flooded through Vladislav, an icy wave washing over the fiery pain. He had tried to hide his plight, to maintain the illusion of his formidable power, but his weakness had become an open secret, a whispered jest in the shadowed halls of his own castle. He was a caricature. A toothless old vampire offered apples by bewildered mortals and turnip juice by his insolent Coven. The ancient terror he once commanded seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a pathetic fragility. He could feel their eyes dissecting him, assessing his frailty, measuring the extent of his decline. He was no longer the apex predator, but a wounded beast, ripe for the culling. He held the glass of turnip juice, its insipid contents a stark symbol of his utter impotence. His fangs, once the terror of a continent, felt like brittle glass, each throbbing pulse a reminder of their betrayal. The mockery, the thinly veiled contempt, the utter lack of fear from his Coven was a new, agonizing dimension to his suffering. He, Vladislav Dracul, Lord of the Night, the Impaler, was undone not by a crusader's blade or a hunter's stake, but by a single recalcitrant molar, and the subsequent humiliating erosion of his authority. The feast continued around him, a silent, cruel pantomime. The Coven members raised their glasses of pale, yellowish liquid, their eyes fixed on him. A chorus of silent, damning laughter echoing in the vast, cold hall. His reign, it seemed, was not ending with a bang, but with the whimpers of a toothache and the clinking of glasses filled with turnip juice. Chapter 5. The Herbalist's last hope, the phantom echoes of the Coven's mocking laughter. more chilling than any physical threat, still resonated in the vast cold halls of Count Vladislav Dracul's ancestral castle. The taste of turnip juice, that vile, earthy insult to his very existence, lingered on his immortal tongue like a perpetual bad omen. His pride, once a towering fortress, had crumbled entirely, leaving him exposed to the gnawing shame of his impotence, and the relentless, skull-splitting agony in his jaw. The failed hunt, the bewildered peasant, and his accursed apple, the unholy spectacle of his Coven's bloodless feast, each humiliation had piled upon the last, cementing his descent from fearsome predator to pathetic invalid. Sleep remained an elusive phantom, its absence a constant reminder of the torment that had usurped his nights. He paced a restless wraith through the dust-laden chambers, his usual predatory silence replaced by the soft, rhythmic groan of his own suffering. Every breath felt like a desperate plea, every thought a surrender to the maddening throb behind his eye. He had plumbed the depths of his own arcane knowledge, consulted the dusty tomes in his forbidden library, and even, in moments of extreme delirium, attempted to commune with the restless spirits of his ancestors for a cure. The spirits, it seemed, were either uninterested in dental woes or simply laughed louder than his Coven. The medieval barber surgeon had been a disaster, offering a cocktail of leeches and his own abhorrent garlic paste, solutions that were either useless or outright detrimental to a creature of the night. He had been left with nothing but a deeper sense of despair and the faint, lingering aroma of bad breath and worse intentions. His conventional options, those familiar paths of supernatural strength and ancient wisdom, had proven utterly, humiliatingly useless. But desperation, even for an immortal, was a potent alchemist. It transmuted pride into pragmatism, and ancient disdain into a desperate, almost suicidal willingness to grasp at any straw, no matter how flimsy or bizarre. He needed relief, not merely for the pain, but for the torment of his eroding dignity. His next recourse, born of pure, unadulterated anguish, was a path he would never have considered in his prime. The world of the herbalist, the eccentric, often misunderstood practitioners of folk medicine who dwelled on the fringes of society. Their remedies, concocted from roots, leaves, and whispered secrets. He sought not science, for that had already failed him in its rudimentary medieval form, but something far more nebulous, something that bordered on magic, or perhaps pure, unadulterated charlatanry. At this point, he barely cared. He heard whispers, carried on the wind and through the furtive gossip of the few mortals, daring enough to venture near his territory, of an old woman, a recluse named Anya, who lived deep within the shadowed folds of the Carpathian Mountains. They said she spoke to trees, that her eyes saw things others could not, and that her potions could cure ailments deemed incurable by the village healers. They also said she sometimes communed with creatures of the night, a detail that had previously intrigued him, but now filled him with a strange, apprehensive hope. It was a long journey, undertaken once more under the concealing cloak of a moonless night, his form hunched and less imposing than a common shadow. Every step was an agony, every rustle of leaves a reminder of the unending throb in his jaw. He found her dwelling nestled in a forgotten hollow, a small, crooked hut of mud and thatch, barely visible amidst the gnarled trees. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, carrying the faint, peculiar scent of dried herbs, and something subtly metallic, almost earthy, but not unpleasant. Strange bundles of dried plants, animal bones, and gleaming crystals hung from the eaves, swaying gently in the unseen currents of the mountain air. The silence here was different, not the oppressive quiet of his castle, but a living, breathing quietude, filled with the rustle of unseen creatures and the faint whispering sigh of the wind through the pines. He pushed open the creaking door, expecting, perhaps, a wizened hag or a mystical oracle. What he found was a woman of indeterminate age, her face a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes sharp and unsettlingly intelligent. observing him from behind a cloud of steam rising from a simmering cauldron. Her hair, the color of spun moonlight, was braided with various colorful beads and dried flowers. She wore a simple homespun dress, but her movements were precise, deliberate, her hands stained with the colors of roots and berries. The interior of the hut was a chaotic wonderland of glass jars filled with liquids of every hue, shelves overflowing with dried herbs, sacks of powders, and bubbling concoctions that filled the air with a dizzying array of aromas. It was a pungent, earthy symphony, a stark contrast to the sterile emptiness of the barber surgeon's shop. "So, the night walker finally seeks solace from the earth's bounty," Anya rasped, her voice surprisingly strong, though edged with a knowing quality that made Vladislav's ancient hackles rise. She didn't ask his name, didn't seem surprised by his spectral appearance or the faint, otherworldly chill that clung to him. She merely gestured to a small three-legged stool near the crackling hearth. "I'll see to..." "The humors are clearly unbalanced, and the spirits of the deep earth are restless in your bone." Vladislav, still clutching his jaw, lowered himself onto the stool, every movement a calculated effort to avoid exacerbating his pain. He expected questions, but Anya simply watched him with those piercing eyes, as if dissecting his very essence. "A deep-seated affliction," she mused, her gaze fixed on his swollen cheek. "A pain that gnaws from within, like a trapped badger. It is not of the flesh alone, but of the spirit, perhaps even the ancient lineage. Many come to me with such woes. The tooth, they say, is a window to the soul." She stirred her cauldron with a gnarled wooden spoon, the contents bubbling with an ominous intensity. "I seek relief," Vladislav managed, his voice strained, raw with desperation. "The pain is unbearable. No mortal remedy has proven effective." He omitted the part about him being immortal, and the mortal remedies having been crude and horrifying. Anya chuckled. A dry, rustling sound like autumn leaves. "Of course not. Mortals seek to excise, to bleed, to purge. They do not understand the delicate dance of balance. The tooth, your tooth, has a will of its own, it seems. It resists. It screams. It demands something unique." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the array of dried ingredients hanging from the rafters. "I have just the thing. A recipe whispered to me by the ancient oaks themselves. A cure for the most stubborn of internal clamorings." Vladislav felt a flicker of cynical hope. This was it. A mystical cure, perhaps one that acknowledged his true nature without naming it. A solution beyond the understanding of crude human hands. "And what," he asked, leaning forward despite the protest of his jaw, "does this unique remedy entail?" Anya's eyes gleamed, a knowing, almost mischievous glint in their depths. "It requires elements of both the earth and the sky, the grounded and the ethereal. For such a deep-seated pain, we need to appeal to the very essence of transformation and cleansing." She began to gather ingredients with practiced ease, her movements strangely fluid. First, the root of the moon petal, steeped in morning dew to calm the angry humors. She placed a small, gnarled root into a stone mortar. Then, the crystallized essence of forgotten spring water to wash away the bitterness. A shimmering shard of something clear was added. "And for the specific nature of your affliction, for the pain that flies and gnaws, we add the wings of a bat." Vladislav froze. His internal bat familiars, those graceful creatures of his castle towers, flashed through his mind. Bat wings? The irony was so profound, it nearly made his throbbing jaw clench in the spasm of something akin to hysterical laughter. He, a creature who could become a bat, was to consume the very essence of his alternate form as a remedy. It was a cosmic joke of the highest order. He pictured his beloved nocturnal companions, soaring through the moonlight, blissfully unaware that parts of their brethren were being ground into a bizarre paste for his benefit. The indignity was almost too much to bear, but the pain, always the pain, reminded him of his desperate plight. Anya, oblivious to his internal turmoil, produced a small dried bat wing, surprisingly intact, its delicate membrane still discernible. She placed it into the mortar with a casual flick of her wrist. For flight, only, to make the pain take wing and depart. The essence of swift movement and liberation from earthly bonds. She then reached for a small, woven pouch and extracted a handful of dried leaves, their scent sharp and distinctly familiar. And finally, for clarity and fresh beginnings, a generous pinch of mountain mint. She crushed the ingredients together with a rhythmic thump, 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 thump of her pestle, creating a dark, viscous paste that smelled oddly pleasant with an underlying earthy funk. The mint, however, was surprisingly potent, cutting through the other scents with a surprising crispness. "There," she declared, scooping a generous dollop of the dark green paste onto a flat, polished stone. "Apply this directly to the offending tooth. Let it sit. Let it permeate. It will draw out the suffering and leave you renewed." Her eyes, for a moment, seemed to twinkle with genuine earnestness. Vladislav took the stone, his fingers brushing against the cool, slick paste. The scent of mint, sharp and invigorating, assaulted his senses. He grimaced, but not from pain this time. The absurdity of it all. He, the terror of Transylvania, meticulously applying a mixture of batwing and mint to his aching fang. He looked at Anya, whose expression was one of profound belief in her own concoction. There was no mockery here, only a strange, unsettling conviction. He felt a fleeting impulse to simply vanish, but his jaw pulsed, a cruel reminder of his predicament. With a deep, shuddering breath, Vladislav gingerly applied the paste to his throbbing gum, directly around the base of the cursed fang. The sensation was immediate and startling. A coolness, then a tingling, followed by a powerful, almost overwhelming surge of minty freshness. His entire mouth was suddenly alight with the invigorating, almost icy blast of the herb. He could feel it penetrating, seeping into the inflamed tissues. He waited, his senses on high alert, for the promised miracle, for the pain to take wing and depart, for the throbbing to subside. He waited for a full minute, an eternity in his pain-racked state. And then another. The minty sensation remained, strong and undeniably pleasant. His breath, for the first time in centuries, was surprisingly, delightfully minty. He could almost discern the faint, earthy undertones of the moonpetal root and the subtle, almost imperceptible tang of the bat wing. But the pain, the agonizing, relentless, soul-crushing throbbing in his upper left canine remained, undiminished, unchanged. It pulsed with the same malevolent rhythm, the same searing intensity, mocking the freshness of his breath, making a cruel jest of the bizarre concoction he had just applied. He looked at Anya, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and utter despair. "My breath is fresh," he managed, his voice flat, devoid of any hope. "But the pain, it is still here. It is still gnawing." Anya tilted her head, observing him. "Ah," she said, her voice unconcerned, "sometimes the full effect takes time. The spirits of the earth move at their own pace. But your breath, you say, is fresh? A good sign. A cleansing from within, even if the root of the issue is stubborn." She offered him a small, knowing smile. "Patience, Nightwalker. And perhaps another application tomorrow." Vladislav felt a wave of utter, soul-destroying futility wash over him. He had sought out ancient power, crude medieval science, and now the esoteric, mystical wisdom of the herbalist. Each attempt had resulted in further humiliation and absolutely no relief. He had resorted to consuming bat wings and mint, and the grand, miraculous result was minty breath. He was a vampire with terrible dental pain and astonishingly good oral hygiene. It was the final, absurd insult in a long litany of indignities. He paid Enya with a handful of ancient coins, not out of hope, but out of a profound bone-deep weariness, and retreated from the hut, the persistent, invigorating scent of mint, a cruel mockery of his continued suffering. The pain remained, a fiery, unyielding beacon in the darkness, and the world seemed only to offer him increasingly absurd and useless remedies, each one a fresh reminder of his humiliating plight. Chapter 6. The night of the broken Fang, the phantom echoes of the Coven's mocking laughter, more chilling than any physical threat, still resonated in the vast, cold halls of Count Vladislav Dracul's ancestral castle. The taste of turnip juice, that vile, earthy insult to his very existence, lingered on his immortal tongue like a perpetual bad omen. His pride, once a towering fortress, had crumbled entirely, leaving him exposed to the gnawing shame of his impotence and the relentless, skull-splitting agony in his jaw. The failed hunt, the bewildered peasant and his accursed apple, the unholy spectacle of his Coven's bloodless feast, each humiliation had piled upon the last, cementing his descent from fearsome predator to pathetic invalid. Sleep remained an elusive phantom, its absence a constant reminder of the torment that had usurped his nights. He paced, a restless wraith, through the dust-laden chambers, his usual predatory silence replaced by the soft, rhythmic groan of his own suffering. Every breath felt like a desperate plea, every thought a surrender to the maddening throb behind his eye. He had plumbed the depths of his own arcane knowledge, consulted the dusty tomes in his forbidden library, and even in moments of extreme delirium, attempted to commune with the restless spirits of his ancestors for a cure. The spirits, it seemed, were either uninterested in dental woes or simply laughed louder than his Coven. The medieval barber surgeon had been a disaster, offering a cocktail of leeches and his own abhorrent garlic paste, solutions that were either useless or outright detrimental to a creature of the night. He had been left with nothing but a deeper sense of despair, and the faint, lingering aroma of bad breath and worse intentions. His conventional options, those familiar paths of supernatural strength and ancient wisdom, had proven utterly, humiliatingly useless. The herbalist, Anya, had provided nothing but the perplexing experience of minty fresh breath, while his internal inferno raged undiminished. A final, cruel, cosmic joke. But desperation, even for an immortal, was a potent alchemist. It transmuted pride into pragmatism, and ancient disdain into a desperate, almost suicidal willingness to grasp at any straw, no matter how flimsy or bizarre. He needed relief, not merely for the pain, but for the torment of his eroding dignity. His current state was an abomination. The sheer gnawing hunger in his gut, a cold, hollow void, was a constant, maddening companion to the pulsating inferno in his jaw. He craved the vibrant, life-giving essence of fresh blood, a yearning as fundamental to his being as the very shadows he commanded. The thought of it, the rich, metallic tang, the warmth, sent a shiver through him that was both longing and dread. He was a vampire, a creature designed for the hunt, for the kill, for the sacred act of sustenance. How could he feed when the instruments of his very nature, his magnificent fangs, had betrayed him so utterly? He chose his hunting ground with a desperate, almost suicidal recklessness. A small, isolated hamlet nestled deep in a valley, its few scattered lights barely piercing the inky blackness. It was a place he would normally deem beneath his attention. Too small, too insignificant. Its inhabitants, too scrawny. But tonight, beggars could not be chooseth. He needed a quick, decisive kill, something to quell the gnawing hunger and the internal screams. His movements, however, were far from decisive. He moved with a stiff, almost brittle quality, each step a careful negotiation with the pain in his jaw. The usual predatory grace was gone, replaced by a shambling gait that resembled a man struggling with a sudden onset of gout, rather than a creature of the night closing in on its prey. He found a solitary figure, a shepherd perhaps, returning late from his flock, his silhouette stark against the faint shimmer of distant stars. The shepherd carried a crook, his head bowed, seemingly lost in thought. An easy mark. Too easy, perhaps, for a predator of Vladislav's former caliber. He launched himself forward, a shadow no longer of terror, but of pathetic urgency. His cape billowed not with menace, but with the desperate flailing of an ailing creature. He intended a swift, silent approach from behind. A lightning strike to the carotid, a quick, clean feed. But as he lunged, his coordination, so precise for half a millennium, betrayed him. His right foot snagged on an unseen root, or perhaps a particularly stubborn clump of thistle, sending a jarring shock wave through his entire frame. A sharp, involuntary yelp of pain escaped his lips, muffled only slightly by the sudden, uncontrolled clenching of his jaw. He stumbled, pitching forward awkwardly, landing not with the elegant pounce of a nocturnal hunter, but with the undignified sprawl of a drunken reveler. The shepherd, startled by the sudden commotion and the faint pained cry, whirled around, his crook raised defensively. His eyes, wide with sudden apprehension, darted through the gloom, searching for the source of the noise. Vladislav, sprawled ignominiously on the damp earth, quickly scrambled to regain his footing, his pride searing hotter than any toothache. He snarled, or attempted to snarl, a sound that emerged as a weak, reedy hiss, his teeth bared in a grimace of pain rather than menace. He lunged again, a desperate, clumsy lunge, his arm outstretched to grab the shepherd, to finally sink his fangs into the pulsating lifeblood he so desperately craved. His good fang, the one on the right, extended, keen and sharp, a fleeting promise of relief. But as he pushed forward, the sheer, unyielding force of his lunge, combined with the extreme vulnerability of his inflamed, agonizing left canine, proved to be too much. There was a sudden, sickening cracking. It was not the sound of bone breaking, or of flesh tearing, but something far more intimate, far more devastating. A sharp, searing bolt of pain, unlike anything he had yet experienced, exploded through the left side of his face. His vision swam, a kaleidoscope of agonizing white light and swirling blackness. He cried out, a raw, primal shriek that would have terrified a legion of crusaders, but which now merely sounded like the tortured wail of a wounded animal. He clutched his jaw, stumbling backward, tripping over his own cape, falling once more into the dirt, whimpering. The shepherd, witnessing this bizarre, self-inflicted calamity, stared, his eyes wide, not with fear but with utter bewilderment. He had expected an attack, perhaps a thief, or a wild animal. He had not expected his assailant to shriek like a banshee and collapse into a heap, clutching their face. Cautiously, the shepherd took a step closer, peering through the dim light. He saw the figure on the ground, twitching, making low, guttural sounds of distress. He saw the thin, gaunt face contorted in an expression of such profound agony that it transcended any perceived threat. And then, as the figure shifted, the shepherd saw something else. A small, white, pointed object lying on the damp earth, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. He bent down hesitantly and picked it up. It was a tooth, a large, unusually sharp tooth, with a tiny fleck of crimson on its root. Vladislav, writhing on the ground, felt a sickening emptiness in his mouth. The throbbing was no longer just a dull ache, but a gaping, searing void where his left upper canine had once majestically resided. His tongue explored the new horrifying cavern, confirming his worst fears. It was gone. His fang, but the very symbol of his power, the instrument of his immortality, had broken off. It lay, pathetic fragment of his former glory, on the cold, damp earth, discarded and useless. He had been rendered, quite literally, toothless on one side. The agony of the exposed nerve, the raw, bleeding gum was immense, but it was nothing compared to the monumental, soul-shattering despair that washed over him. He had faced 1,000 battles, outwitted countless hunters, endured centuries of loneliness and the relentless march of time. But this was his true undoing. He lay there, whimpering, his magnificent reputation reduced to a shattered piece of enamel. The shepherd, still holding the offending tooth, looked from it to the convulsing form on the ground. "By the saints above!" the shepherd exclaimed, his voice tinged with genuine concern. "You've lost a tooth. A big one, too. Is that what all the fuss was about? Poor fellow. That must hurt something awful." He dropped the tooth as if it were a burning coal, suddenly realizing its unnatural size and sharpness, a faint shiver finally running down his spine. But it was a shiver of mild unease, not terror. Vladislav, for once, did not rise to deliver a swift, terrifying retribution. He merely lay there, a broken, whimpering husk of his former self. The shepherd, sensing no further aggression, decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and continued on his way, casting a few bewildered glances back at the strange, moaning figure in the shadows. He had a story to tell at the tavern, about a very odd, very clumsy man who had screamed and lost a tooth in the middle of the woods. As the shepherd's lantern faded into the distance, Vladislav slowly, painfully, dragged himself to his feet. The night air, once a comfort, now felt chillingly indifferent. He touched his tongue to the raw, empty socket, the pain afresh, brutal reminder of his new reality. One Fang remained, a solitary, lonely sentinel, but it felt utterly useless, a blunt instrument without its partner. He was an archer without a bowstring, a warrior without a sword. He was a vampire who could no longer bite. He stumbled back towards his castle, not with the usual swift, silent retreat of a predator, but with the slow, mournful drag of a defeated creature. Each step was a pilgrimage into a deeper abyss of self-pity and existential dread. He reached the familiar, crumbling walls of his fortress, its ancient stones offering no comfort, only silent judgment. He entered his private chambers, the vast, echoing space seeming even larger, even emptier now. He collapsed onto his sarcophagus, not for rest, but for a night of profound, agonizing contemplation. He mourned the loss, not just of the Fang, but of the formidable image it represented. He had been the epitome of predatory efficiency, a creature of refined terror. Now, he was a clumsy, broken thing, his very tools of existence failing him. He ran a clawed finger over the empty space in his gum, a raw, sensitive void. He remembered the thrill of the hunt, the satisfying crunch as his fangs sank into warm flesh, the rush of vital essence. Those memories were now distant, like faded tapestries, replaced by the vivid, burning shame of his recent failures, the peasant, the apple, the turnip juice, the futile minty breath, and now the humiliating fracture of his own identity. What was a vampire without fangs? A king without a crown? A poet without words? He was a grotesque parody of his former self, an immortal being brought low by a pathetic, mundane affliction. The absurdity of his existence was a vast, cosmic joke, and he was the punchline. 500 years of terror, reduced to a whimpering, one-fanged caricature. He gazed at the moon, a cold, indifferent orb in the heavens. It had witnessed his many triumphs, his countless conquests. Now, it witnessed his ultimate humiliation. He was Vladislav Dracul, Lord of the Night, the Impaler. But he was also just a very, very old being with a dental emergency of epic, universe-shattering proportions. The dawn would bring no solace, only the reminder of a new, toothless reality. He lay there, for what felt like an eternity. The broken Fang, an unseen yet palpable weight in the hollow of his being, mocking his immortality, his power, and his very purpose. The pain throbbed, a steady, relentless rhythm, no longer a beacon of agony, but a mournful dirge for his shattered reign. He was adrift in a sea of his own ridiculousness. Chapter 7. The Rise of the Vampire. Barber, the relentless, soul-crushing agony in Count Vladislav Dracul's jaw. Once a mere physical torment had metastasized into an existential wound. The sickening cracky of his fang, the very symbol of his predatory might, had echoed not just through his skull, but through the hollow chambers of his eternal being. He was a king without a crown, a lion stripped of its claws, a vampire rendered utterly incapable of the act that defined his immortality. The memory of the peasant Bogdan and his baffling offer of a crisp, unyielding apple lingered like a particularly unpleasant aftertaste. The chilling laughter of his coven, amplified by the vapid taste of turnip juice, was a constant, mocking chorus in his mind. He had sought solace in ancient texts, in crude human remedies, in esoteric herbal concoctions, and each attempt had only deepened the well of his despair, culminating in the final, humiliating disfigurement. He was left with a gaping void in his gum, a raw, sensitive wound that pulsed with a pain so profound it threatened to unravel his very sanity, and the constant, maddening emptiness in his gut. A hunger that no amount of lukewarm claret could ever truly sate. He spent the subsequent nights in a state of tormented limbo, pacing the great hall of his castle, a gaunt, ghostly figure. His ancestral home, once a bastion of silent power, now felt like a mausoleum of mockery. The very air seemed to vibrate with the derision of his coven, though they were nowhere to be seen, having retreated to their own shadowed corners, leaving him to wallow in his toothless misery. He was trapped, a creature of immense power rendered helpless by a mundane biological flaw. The absurdity of his predicament was a bitter potion he was forced to drink with every agonizing breath. What was a vampire to do when the very act of feeding became an impossibility, a torturous reminder of his fallen state? He could not bite. The thought of it, the mere pressure on his remaining, sensitive fangs, sent spasms of preemptive agony through his skull. He was a predator in a gilded cage, starving. Then, amidst the swirling miasma of pain and self-pity, a thought, as insidious as it was brilliant, began to form. It was a twisted echo of his encounter with Master Elara, the bumbling barber surgeon, but filtered through the cold, calculating logic of a centuries-old mind. Blood. He needed blood, but not by the Fang. He remembered Elara's talk of humors and bloodletting, crude as it was. What if he could access the vital essence without the direct, painful act of biting? What if he could draw it? The idea, initially repulsive in its sheer mundanity, slowly began to solidify into a desperate, viable plan. He might be toothless, but he was still a vampire. He understood the intricate dance of veins and arteries better than any mortal, better than any crude barber surgeon. He possessed an inherent, almost supernatural precision, a steady hand that could manipulate delicate tissues, a knowledge of the body born of millennia of intimate, if violent, acquaintance. The transformation was gradual, agonizingly slow. He could not remain in his crumbling castle, a mockery of a lord, a symbol of ridicule for his coven. He needed anonymity, a new stage for his absurd play. He chose another, small, unremarkable village, nestled deeper in a forgotten valley, even more isolated than the last. He shed his regal attire, adopting the drab, homespun garments of a respectable, if somewhat somber, craftsman. He cultivated a carefully trimmed beard to further obscure his ancient features and his gaunt, pain-racked face, pulling his hat low over his eyes. His name, Count Vladislav Dracul was replaced by a simple, unassuming moniker, Master Valeriu, a man of quiet demeanor and, as he would soon prove, an unexpectedly gentle touch. His new establishment was a humble affair, a single room in a modest cottage, far removed from the grandeur of his ancestral halls. The sign, painted by his own steady, albeit pained hand, read simply, Valeriu's Cures and Cuts. Inside, it was a stark contrast to Ilara's chaotic hovel. Vladislav, with his centuries of accumulated wealth and the vampire's innate appreciation for cleanliness, despite his current dishevelment, managed to outfit the place with a surprising degree of order. There was a worn but sturdy wooden chair, a small table covered with a clean linen cloth, and shelves displaying an array of glass jars filled not with wriggling leeches, but with meticulously prepared tinctures and soothing balm. The air was kept scrupulously clean, scented faintly with rosemary and lavender, a deliberate counterpoint to the usual squalor of village life. His tools were his own, forged under his precise instructions by a bewildered local blacksmith, who wondered why a quiet, gaunt man needed such fine, slender lancets and such meticulously balanced razors. These were not the crude instruments of a common barber surgeon. They were instruments of surgical precision, gleaming and sharp, their edges honed to a razor-fine point. He also acquired a set of delicate phlebotomy bowls, specifically designed to catch the flowing crimson, each with a spout that allowed for easy, discreet transfer to a smaller, more private vessel. The irony of it all was a constant, bitter companion. He, the impaler, now honed tools not for terror, but for delicate life-preserving and life-sustaining for him, acts. His first client was a grizzled farmer, a man named George, suffering from a persistent headache and a general feeling of bad humors. George approached Master Valeriu's shop with the usual peasant skepticism, having experienced the clumsy, often painful ministrations of less skilled practitioners. Vladislav, adopting an air of quiet professionalism, motioned the man to the chair. His immortal senses, though dulled by pain, were still incredibly keen. He could hear the sluggish thrum of George's blood, taste the faint, earthy notes of his diet, and, most importantly, perceive the exact location of the most superficial, easily accessible vein. He explained the process in a low, soothing voice, a hypnotic cadence honed over centuries of subtly influencing mortal minds. "We shall release a small amount of the offending humors," Vladislav intoned, his voice devoid of any vampiric menace, to restore the balance within. "You will feel a mere prick, like the bite of a mosquito, no more." He chose a vein on the inner forearm, a plump, easily accessible target. With a hand that was steady as a stone despite the throbbing torment in his jaw, he applied a precise, almost imperceptible pressure, then, with the swift, silent grace of a true predator, made the incision. George tensed, bracing for the usual searing pain, the clumsy sawing of a dull blade. But there was only a fleeting, incredibly faint prick, followed by the warm, gentle gush of blood into the bowl. His eyes widened in surprise. "By the heavens!" he exclaimed. "I barely felt a thing. Master Valeriu." That was like a feather's touch. Vladislav nodded gravely, carefully watching the blood flow, calculating the exact amount needed for sustenance, careful not to overdraw. His eyes, typically predatory, now held a focused, almost clinical intensity. He silently reveled in the warmth of the fresh blood, the faint, vital aroma that finally promised to quell the hunger. It was not the exhilarating rush of a direct bite, but a slow, dignified, and utterly necessary acquisition. He subtly diverted a portion of the flow into a small, hidden flask, while allowing the rest to collect in the visible bowl, as per the customary practice of bloodletting. He cleaned the wound meticulously, applying a soothing balm of herbs gathered from the nearby woods. "Dio, Consi," feeling a strange lightness in his head that he mistook for relief from his humors, stood up, marveling. "A miracle, Master Valerio. Truly. The headache, it is as if a weight has been lifted. And no bruising, no throbbing. You have a gift. Truly." He paid his meager coin, his gratitude radiating from him, and shuffled out, spreading word of the gentle Barber throughout the village. Word spread quickly. In a time when medical treatment was often more torturous than the ailment itself, Master Valerio's painless bloodletting was nothing short of miraculous. Peasants, blacksmiths, even the local priest, afflicted with everything from persistent coughs to melancholy humors, flocked to his humble shop. Vladislav, the once feared Lord of Darkness, found himself performing delicate incisions, meticulously collecting blood, and listening to the mundane ailments of mortals. He would nod solemnly, offer soothing words, and always perform the bloodletting with a touch so gentle, so precise that his clients left praising his miraculous skill. He quickly learned to gauge their vitality, to take just enough to sate his gnawing hunger without raising suspicion. The blood, though not consumed directly from the vein, was fresh, vital, and slowly, incrementally, it began to restore a flicker of his former strength, a subtle lessening of the chronic fatigue that had plagued him. The hunger in his gut remained, a dull echo of his former craving, but it was no longer the all-consuming void. The irony of his new life was a constant, bitter companion. He, Vladislav Dracul, who had once impaled thousands, now carefully, delicately, drew blood to heal them. He was praised for his gentle touch, for his miraculous cures, all while secretly sustaining himself on the very fluid he purported to extract for their benefit. He listened to their simple tales of crops and livestock, their anxieties about the weather, their complaints of aching joints and evil humors, his ancient mind a maelstrom of disdain and grudging necessity. He, who had commanded armies and struck fear into the hearts of nations, now meticulously trimmed beards and applied compresses, all while his remaining fang throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a constant physical reminder of his profound, absurd downfall. The pain in his jaw, though still present, felt somehow different. It was no longer the sole focus of his existence. It was a backdrop, a constant, dull thrum beneath the surface of his new, peculiar life. He was surviving. He was, even in the most twisted, ironic sense, thriving. He was a vampire, a creature of the night, now a respected, gentle barber surgeon in a forgotten village. His hands stained not with the blood of conquest, but with the careful, controlled trickle of blood drawn for healing. He was no longer the Lord of the Night, but Valerio, the gentle bloodletter, his existence a profound, darkly humorous testament to the lengths an ancient, toothless vampire would go to for a decent meal, and perhaps a quiet night's sleep, or at least a quiet night's contemplation of his new, utterly bizarre reality. The moon, peering through the small window of his barber shop, seemed to watch him with a knowing, almost pitying gaze, reflecting his new, strange life. Chapter 8. The blood bank heist. The incessant, dull ache in Count Vladislav Dracul's jaw, a persistent hum beneath the surface of his long, peculiar existence, was a constant, physical tether to his profound, absurd downfall. The shattered memory of his broken fang, the sickening gong craki that had cleaved his very essence, had never truly faded. His years as Master Valerio, the gentle barber surgeon, had granted him a measure of uneasy peace, a sustainable, if utterly undignified, form of sustenance. He had moved with the imperceptible flow of centuries, adapting to the subtle shifts in human society, from gas lamps to electric glow, from horse-drawn carriages to whirring contraptions of steel and fire. The hum of modern life, a cacophony of new sounds and blinding lights, was a constant assault on his ancient senses. Yet he had endured. He continued to ply his trade, his steady, practiced hands still capable of drawing blood with a near miraculous precision, his clients still praising his quiet demeanor and remarkably gentle touch. He had become adept at navigating the bewildering advancements of human ingenuity. His mind, though ancient, still sharp enough to learn the intricate dance of modern commerce and anonymity. But even in the midst of this strange new world, the underlying hunger, the primal, insatiable craving for the vibrant, untainted essence of life, remained. The small, carefully measured amounts of blood he collected in his humble barber shop, while sufficient to prevent his ultimate dissipation, were far from the glorious, invigorating feasts of old. He felt perpetually underfed, a phantom of his former formidable self, forever teetering on the edge of a deep, soul-consuming malaise. One particularly desolate night, as the harsh, artificial glow of streetlights painted garish shadows across the rain-slicked pavement outside his latest nondescript urban abode, the hunger intensified. It was a sharp, biting pang, a primal scream from the depths of his being that surpassed the usual background throb of his damaged jaw. His remaining fang, a solitary, lonely sentinel, seemed to vibrate with a phantom echo of its lost twin, a cruel reminder of his crippling limitation. He craved more than mere sustenance. He craved the abundance, the raw, untamed vitality that only a true, glorious feast could provide. He yearned for the days when he could sweep down upon a village, a living shadow, and sate his hunger with impunity, leaving only terror and whispers in his wake. Those days, he knew, were gone. The world had shrunk, become too bright, too interconnected, too full of curious devices that could pierce the veil of his ancient mystique. Yet, a new, peculiar form of abundance had presented itself. He had, in his careful observation of this bewildering modern age, learned of places where blood was stored, not in crude, earthen vessels, but in sterile, gleaming facilities, vast repositories of the very essence he craved. They called them blood banks. The concept was both revolting in its clinical detachment and tantalizing in its sheer promise of concentrated bounty. A human institution, collecting and preserving the very lifeblood of its populace. Ostensibly for healing, but to Vladislav, it was a vast, untapped larder. The thought of it, a warehouse full of rich, red vitality waiting, ready, required no messy hunts, no fumbling attempts at a bite that only exacerbated his dental woes. It was a solution, he reasoned, born of this new, peculiar age, one that might finally quell the gnawing emptiness within him. He chose his target with the meticulous precision of an ancient predator, albeit one whose primary weapon was irrevocably broken. A large, imposing building of concrete and glass, its windows dark and uninviting, nestled on the outskirts of the sprawling modern city. The sign, illuminated by a flickering fluorescent tube, reads simply, City Central Blood Repository. It pulsed with a sterile, almost cold aura, but Vladislav's heightened senses could detect the faint metallic tang of countless liters of human blood, contained, preserved, waiting. The air around it seemed to hum with a strange, contained vitality. He felt a surge of something akin to excitement, a flicker of his old predatory thrill despite the constant dull ache in his jaw. This was it, a modern solution to an ancient problem. The break-in was a clumsy affair, a testament to his continued decline in physical prowess and his profound unfamiliarity with modern security measures. He tried a window, only to find it reinforced with an invisible, impenetrable barrier. He tried a door, only to be met by a bewildering array of locks and alarms that emitted shrill, piercing shrieks when tampered with. His ancient powers of shape-shifting seemed sluggish, unresponsive, dulled by the ceaseless pain and years of inadequate nourishment. He longed for the simpler times of creaking wooden doors and startled peasants. Finally, with a desperate, frustrated surge of his limited strength, he found a seldom-used service entrance, its lock old and rusted, yielding with a grunt of protest to his bare hands. He slipped inside, a shadow of desperation rather than menace, his heart hammering with a mixture of illicit thrill and profound anticipation. The interior was a sterile, brightly lit labyrinth of pristine white walls and gleaming metal. The air was frigid, thick with the antiseptic scent of disinfectant and the faint, sweet metallic tang of preserved blood. Rows upon rows of enormous humming refrigeration units lined the corridors, their glass doors revealing the glorious sight within. Countless bags of blood, neatly stacked, labeled, and glowing with a deep, inviting crimson under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was a sight that brought a desperate, tear-like moisture to Vladislav's ancient eyes. So much blood. A veritable ocean of it, untouched, waiting. This was more bounty than he had feasted upon in centuries. His remaining fang throbbed with an almost unbearable eagerness, even as his broken side pulsed with a familiar agony. He approached the nearest refrigeration unit, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. He slid open the heavy glass door, the sudden rush of icy air a shock against his face. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cool, pliable plastic of a blood bag. It was a standard unit, plump with type O negative, perfectly chilled. He pulled it out, cradling it in his hands, admiring its rich, dark color. This was it. Salvation. Please. He brought the bag to his mouth, his remaining fang extending, a single, hopeful spear point. He positioned the sharp tip against the pliable plastic, ready to pierce, to draw the life-giving liquid into his parched throat. He pushed, the hunger, a roaring inferno within him, and nothing. The plastic, though thin, was surprisingly resilient. His remaining fang, sharp as it was, merely dented the surface, sliding uselessly. It was not designed for this. It was designed for flesh, for muscle, for the delicate membrane of a vein, not for the stubborn modern ingenuity of polyethylene. He tried again, pushing harder, gritting his teeth, sending a fresh, searing bolt of pain through his afflicted jaw. He tried the broken side, forgetting for a moment its uselessness, only to meet the raw, exposed nerve with the unyielding plastic, sending a shriek, a low, guttural wail, echoing through the sterile halls. His eyes watered, his face contorted in a grimace of pure agony and utter, soul-destroying frustration. He fumbled with the bag, turning it over, searching desperately for an opening, a weakness. There was a small sealed spout at the top, a plastic tube that defied his ancient blunt nails and his trembling, clawed fingers. He tried to tear it with his hands, to rip the plastic open, but it was too smooth, too strong, too resistant to his desperate fumbling. He grunted, he moaned. He tried to bite again, harder, more desperately, but each attempt only sent further jolts of pain through his jaw, while the plastic remained utterly, stubbornly intact. The bags, so tantalizingly full, mocked him from their sterile shelves. An ocean he could not drink. He was a starving man surrounded by impenetrable, unopenable bottles of water. The muffled thumping of footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing steadily louder. A beam of light, harsh and accusatory, sliced through the gloom. Vladislav froze, his heart, or what passed for it, sinking with a leaden thud. He had been caught, but not in the glorious pursuit of a hunt, not in the triumphant act of feeding, but in the pathetic, futile struggle against a plastic bag. Two figures emerged from the shadows, bulky in their uniforms, their faces etched with the weary resignation of men accustomed to dealing with the absurdities of the night. Security guards. Chief one, a burly man with a walrus mustache, held a large, clunky flashlight. The other, younger, thinner, held a communication device to his ear. Well, what do we have here?" The burly guard rumbled, his voice tired, not menacing. Another one. "Sir, you shouldn't be here. This is a restricted area." Vladislav, still clutching the unopened blood bag, stood frozen, his face a mask of profound agony and utter defeat. He looked disheveled, gaunt, his eyes bloodshot from centuries of sleeplessness and the perpetual gnawing of his dental woes. He looked less like a fearsome monster, and more like a very old, very unwell vagrant who had somehow wandered into the wrong place. The younger guard, after a brief exchange into his device, lowered it, his brow furrowed with something akin to pity. Looks like he's just lost, and maybe a bit confused. Sir, are you all right? You look awful pale, and you're bleeding. He gestured vaguely at Vladislav's mouth, where a faint trickle of blood from his abraded gum mixed with the ghost of minty freshness from Anya's potion. Vladislav felt a fresh wave of humiliation. Bleeding. Vladislav Dracul, bleeding from his own pathetic attempts to bite a plastic bag. The ultimate indignity. He tried to speak, to conjure a terrifying threat. A command that would send them fleeing in terror. But all that emerged was a pained groan, followed by a faint, almost pathetic whimper. He clutched his jaw, the blood bag still clutched in his other hand, a symbol of his utter profound failure. The burly guard sighed, a sound of long-suffering weariness. Another one. Always the quiet ones. Here, buddy, let's get you sorted. He didn't approach with a weapon drawn, or with hostility. He approached with the gentle, practiced movements of someone accustomed to dealing with the disoriented and the desperate. You don't look like you're here to steal anything valuable. Well, you look like you need a good meal and a warm bed, and maybe a dentist. He eyed the blood bag in Vladislav's hand. You trying to drink that? Fela. That's not for drinking straight. It's for transfusions. You'll get sick. The younger guard, seeing Vladislav's continued distress, took a tentative step closer. He looks hungry, Frank. Maybe we should just offer him some water. Or a sandwich. Vladislav stared at them, his mind reeling. Sandwich? And water. They were not afraid. They were eye-pitying him. The terror of the Carpathians, reduced to an object of common human sympathy, offered a sandwich. It was the peasant, Bogdan, all over again, but amplified by the impersonal sterility of the modern age. He was not seen as a threat, but as a problem, an unfortunate soul to be dealt with, gently, paternally. The burly guard, Frank, reached out a surprisingly gentle hand, taking the pristine blood bag from Vladislav's slackened grip. Come on, buddy. We'll get you out of here. No trouble, just go on home. You look like you've had a rough night. He guided Vladislav firmly, but gently towards the service entrance, which Vladislav had so laboriously broken. Vladislav allowed himself to be led, his ancient spirit utterly crushed. He was too weak, too pain-racked, too profoundly humiliated to resist. His monstrous, terrifying nature, once so potent, was utterly lost on these modern humans who saw only a gaunt, confused man in distress. He was no longer a creature of the night, but a pitiful, dental-challenged aberration. He stumbled out into the cool night air, leaving behind the brightly lit, tantalizingly full blood bank, his mouth still aching, his stomach still empty, his pride utterly annihilated. The city lights seemed to mock him, shining down on his pathetic retreat, illuminating the absurdity of his immortal predicament. He was Vladislav Dracul, Lord of the Night, the Impaler, now merely a homeless, hungry, and tooth-deficient vagrant lost in a world he no longer understood, pitied by the very mortals he was meant to prey upon. The dull throb in his jaw was a constant, mournful dirge for his shattered reign, a grim reminder of his utter unvampiric failure. Chapter 9. The dentist's unexpected revelation, the humiliation of the blood bank heist, that sterile, brightly lit monument to his utter impotence, had settled over Count Vladislav Dracul like a shroud woven from shattered dignity and the faint, unsettling scent of antiseptic. His retreat from the city's central blood repository was less a strategic withdrawal and more a bewildered stumble through a labyrinth of neon signs and blaring traffic. He, the terror of nations, had been caught, not by hunters or holy men, but by weary security guards who had looked upon him not with fear, but with an exasperated pity reserved for the disoriented and the truly, profoundly unwell. He was not a monster. He was a problem, a gaunt, confused man offered a sandwich instead of a steak. The one remaining fang in his mouth, the sole survivor of his dental cataclysm, felt utterly useless. A blunt instrument in a world that no longer understood the ancient art of biting. The pain, however, remained. It was a constant, malevolent thrum in his jaw, a deep, bone-weary ache that had become as much a part of his existence as the very blood he craved, but could no longer reliably acquire. His years as Master Valerio, the gentle barber surgeon, had kept him from dissipating entirely, providing a trickle of sustenance, but the emptiness in his gut was a perpetual hollow echo of the grand feasts he had once commanded. The world, he realized with a chilling certainty, had definitively moved on from him. He wandered the modern city streets in the dead of night, a spectral anomaly in a landscape of harsh artificial lights and ceaseless mechanical hums. The Gothic grandeur of his castle felt impossibly distant, a mere whisper from another age. He was adrift, his ancient purpose eroded by a microscopic biological rebellion within his own jaw. He had tried everything: the medieval quackery of Master Alara, the perplexing herbal concoctions of Anya, even the crude desperation of self-extraction, each attempt culminating in further ignominy and absolutely no relief. The gnawing pain had driven him to such depths of desperation that even the thought of interacting with modern mortals, with their baffling contraptions and unnerving cheerfulness, no longer filled him with his usual disdain, but with a hollow, weary resignation. He needed relief. He needed it more than he needed to reclaim his coven's respect, more than he needed to strike fear into the hearts of men. He simply needed the pain to stop. It was a sign, flickering sporadically in the relentless glow of 1,000 other signs, that caught his eye. Dr. Alistair Finch, General Dentistry, Open Lat. The words, illuminated by a pale, buzzing, fluorescent tube, seemed to mock him with their promise of mundane human solutions to his profound, immortal problem. He hesitated, his ancient instincts screaming in protest. A dentist, not a barber surgeon, not a mystical herbalist, but a practitioner of the most prosaic of human afflictions. It was the ultimate capitulation, a final surrender to the utterly ordinary. But the pain, that unrelenting, malevolent drumbeat in his jaw, drowned out the screams of his dying pride. He shuffled forward, a gaunt, cloaked figure moving against the current of late-night revelers and the endless rush of automobiles, a shadow of despair in a world too bright to properly contain him. The office was surprisingly small, tucked between a purveyor of shimmering electronic devices and a brightly lit establishment that sold processed foodstuffs in colorful, crinkling packages. Inside, it was a world of muted tones and hushed efficiency. The air smelled not of stale ale or pungent herbs, but of something vaguely minty and clinically clean, an aroma that instantly reminded him of Anya's useless yet surprisingly effective breath remedy. A polite, unnervingly calm woman with a headpiece attached to her ear sat behind a gleaming, polished counter, her fingers dancing across a luminous screen. She did not recoil from his gaunt appearance, merely offered a practiced, sympathetic smile. "Well, welcome. Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice even, unhurried. Vladislav, unaccustomed to such polite inquiry, merely grunted, clutching his jaw. "Pain," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse and discomfort. "Here." He pointed a trembling finger at his swollen cheek, forcing himself to appear as frail and human as possible. The receptionist merely nodded, her sympathetic smile unwavering. "Ah, a walk-in emergency. Dr. Finch will be with you shortly. Please, take a seat." She gestured to a row of surprisingly comfortable, padded chairs, upholstered in a muted, earthy green. There were magazines on a small table, their glossy pages filled with images of impossibly cheerful humans engaged in baffling activities like gardening and home improvement. Vladislav sank onto a chair, the unexpected softness a strange comfort against his weary form. He closed his eyes. The relentless throb in his jaw, the only constant in this bewildering, brightly lit purgatory. A short while later, a door opened, and a man emerged. This was Dr. Alistair Finch. He was not the towering, imposing figure Vladislav might have expected from a professional of such modern skill. Instead, he was a slender, balding man in a pristine white coat, with kind, intelligent eyes, magnified by thick spectacles. His smile was genuine, unpracticed, and held a peculiar blend of weariness and quiet dedication. He looked at Vladislav, not with suspicion or fear, but with a gentle concern that was utterly disarming. "Master Valeriu, is it?" he asked, consulting a small, illuminated tablet in his hand. "Come this way. Let's have a look at what's troubling you." Vladislav, with a deep, shuddering breath, followed him into a smaller, brightly lit room. The room was dominated by a sleek, reclining chair, surrounded by an array of gleaming metal instruments that looked both terrifyingly precise and strangely elegant. There were lights, bright and focused, and screens displaying intricate ghostly images of teeth and bone. The air was still and cool, the scent of antiseptic stronger here. Vladislav, still maintaining his posture of a very old, very unwell man, sank into the reclining chair, its automated movements startlingly smooth. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, donned a pair of thin, latex gloves and a small circular mirror attached to a handle. He leaned over Vladislav, his breath surprisingly fresh, almost like the minty concoction from Anya. "Just relax, Master Valeriu," he murmured, his voice soothing. "Let's see what's causing all this distress." He carefully angled a small light attached to his forehead, illuminating the interior of Vladislav's mouth with an intense, unblinking beam. Vladislav had to suppress a primal urge to recoil, to snap, to turn into a cloud of mist and flee. This was it. Exposure. The brilliant light revealed every flaw, every crevice, every dark secret of his ancient mouth. He forced his jaw open, exposing his remaining painfully sensitive fang and the gaping, raw void where its twin had once majestically resided. Dr. Finch peered in, his brow furrowed in concentration. He gently probed the area around the broken fang, a delicate touch that miraculously caused less pain than the clumsy prodding of Master Ilara. He made soft, thoughtful hums, occasionally glancing at the glowing screen beside him. Yes, Dr. Finch murmured, pulling back slightly. "A rather unique case, Master Valerio. This is a very old injury, clearly, and the tissue around this remaining canine, quite inflamed." And this other side, he leaned in again, shining the light directly into the empty socket, a clean fracture, surprisingly. "Quite the impact, I imagine." He spoke with a quiet, analytical detachment, yet his tone was infused with a genuine curiosity and a profound empathy. He didn't question the nature of the teeth, their unusual length or sharpness. He simply observed their state of disrepair. He then pulled a small, slender probe from a sterilized tray, its tip glinting under the light. "I'm going to gently explore the root of this pain, if I may. There appears to be significant decay at the very base of your remaining tooth, deeper than anything I've encountered. It's quite remarkable." He carefully, almost imperceptibly, touched the probe to the base of Vladislav's remaining fang. A searing, excruciating bolt of pain, sharper and more intense than anything Vladislav had experienced in centuries, shot through his skull. He gasped, his body tensing, his hands clenching into fists. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to rip the man's throat out. But the pain was so utterly overwhelming that he could do nothing but writhe slightly in the chair, a low, guttural moan escaping his lips. Dr. Finch immediately withdrew the probe, his face etched with concern. "My apologies," he exclaimed, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "That was clearly too much. I see. The nerve is very much alive and deeply irritated. This is not a simple cavity, Master Valerio. This is profound. Remarkable, even." He leaned back, taking off his spectacles and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at Vladislav with a new, deeper level of contemplation, his eyes holding not fear or judgment, but a strange blend of scientific fascination and human compassion. "I've seen a great many teeth in my years, Master Valerio," Dr. Finch began, his voice softer, almost reverent. "But yours are truly exceptional. They defy conventional understanding. The decay I see, it's not merely progressive. It's as if it has been occurring for an impossibly long time, as if it's an intrinsic part of the tooth's very being, a slow, unceasing process that no normal biological mechanism could possibly sustain or resist. The vitality of the nerve. Despite such profound and long-standing decay, it's unheard of. It's as if the tooth itself refuses to die, even as it crumbles from within." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Vladislav watched him, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and a faint, hesitant glimmer of something he hadn't felt in centuries. Hope. This man, this mortal, this identistist, was taking his pain seriously. He wasn't dismissing it, wasn't offering leeches or turnip juice. He was observing, thinking, understanding in his own human way. "I believe," Dr. Finch continued, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, "that what you are suffering from, Master Valerio, is a unique condition, a condition I can only describe as eternal tooth decay." He met Vladislav's eyes, a profound empathy shining through his thick lenses. "It appears to be a degenerative process that has been ongoing for centuries, perhaps even longer. A decay that is as enduring as the tooth itself. A decay that, in essence, is immortal. Your fangs, Master Valerio, while undeniably robust, seem to carry within them the seeds of their own perpetual decline. A most fascinating, and I imagine, most excruciating affliction." Vladislav stared at him, utterly stunned. "Eternal tooth decaying." The phrase resonated deep within him, touching a core truth he had never articulated. It was absurd, yet profoundly accurate. His fangs, symbols of his immortality, were also cursed with an immortal ailment. It was a condition as enduring as his very life. And this human, this kind, unassuming dentist had seen it. He had diagnosed it with a term that, while perhaps unscientific by mortal standards, perfectly encapsulated the impossible nature of his suffering. A strange warmth spread through Vladislav's ancient, undead heart. It was not the warmth of freshly consumed blood, nor the illusory comfort of a crackling fire. It was the warmth of being seen. For centuries he had been an object of terror, then mockery, then pity. But this man, this Dr. Finch, saw his pain, recognized its profound and unique nature, and offered not ridicule, but solemn understanding and compassion. He was not a monster to be feared, nor a joke to be laughed at, nor a nuisance to be dismissed. He was a patient with an impossibly old, impossibly painful, and impossibly persistent toothache. "Doctor," Finch sighed, a sound of gentle concern. "I wish I could tell you that I have an immediate cure, Master Valerio. This sort of decay, it's beyond anything conventional. But we can certainly manage the pain. We can explore options to alleviate your discomfort. Perhaps a root canal, if the tooth can withstand it, though the sheer scale of the decay suggests a challenge. or even, reluctantly, extraction of the offending tooth. If all else fails. He paused, looking directly into Vladislav's shadowed eyes. But please know, Master Valerio, that I believe you. Your pain is real, and it is quite clearly immense. I will do everything I can to help you. Vladislav, for the first time in what felt like centuries, felt a strange, almost alien sensation in his chest. It was a sensation not unlike relief, but far deeper, tinged with a profound, almost overwhelming sense of gratitude. This human, this gentle, bespectacled man had shown him a kindness he had not anticipated, a genuine empathy that pierced through the layers of his ancient cynicism. He, Vladislav Dracul, the Lord of the Night, the Impaler, was being offered compassion by a mortal dentist, a man who saw his suffering, acknowledged its eternal nature, and promised to alleviate it. It was the most unexpected revelation of his long existence. The throbbing in his jaw was still there, a constant, dull companion. But for the first time, it felt less like a relentless torment and more like a shared burden. He had found, in the most unlikely of places, not a cure, but understanding. And for a creature as old and alone as he, that was perhaps a greater balm than any potion or incantation. The bright, sterile lights of the dental office, once an assault, now seemed to cast a strange, quiet glow, illuminating a path he never knew existed. Chapter 10. The Vampire's New Diet. The words of Dr. Alistair Finch, that unassuming, spectacled mortal, resonated within Count Vladislav Dracul with a peculiar, almost haunting clarity. Eternal tooth decay. It was a diagnosis both preposterous and profoundly, undeniably accurate. It had stripped away the last, clinging vestiges of his ancient pride, but in doing so it had also offered a strange, unsettling form of liberation. His torment, a personal, agonizing betrayal of his own immortal flesh, was not a sign of his impending doom or divine curse, but simply an immutable, eternal flaw in his very being. His fangs, those once magnificent instruments of terror, were destined to crumble from within forever. The pain, though still a relentless, malevolent thrum in his jaw, no longer felt like a fleeting crisis to be overcome, but a permanent companion, a chronic, absurd burden. The sheer, overwhelming relief of being understood in, even by a mortal, even for something so monumentally ridiculous, had been a balm unlike any potion or incantation. It was the first time in centuries he felt a quiet resignation, a strange acceptance of his fate, however ludicrous that fate might be. The blood bank debacle, that brightly lit tableau of his utter impotence, now seemed like a distant, albeit humiliating, memory. The security guard's weary pity, the casual offer of a sandwich still pricked at the raw edges of his dignity, but it no longer consumed him. He was a vampire, yes, but also a creature of adaptation, a survivor who had weathered plagues, wars, and the relentless march of human ingenuity for half a millennium. He could not bite. That was the unassailable truth. His remaining fang, while still technically present, felt like a brittle, useless ornament, its very sensitivity a cruel reminder of its broken counterpart. The primal, insatiable hunger, however, remained a cold, hollow ache in his gut, a constant, nagging demand for the vital essence that fueled his immortality. The small, carefully measured amounts of blood from his unwitting clients in his barber shop, while keeping him from complete dissipation, left him perpetually on the precipice of true, satisfying sustenance. He needed a new way, a new path, a diet. The idea came to him during a particularly introspective night, as he sat in his modest, anonymous urban dwelling, contemplating the bewildering array of consumer goods advertised on the luminous rectangular device the humans called a television. A commercial blaring with unnatural cheerfulness showcased a crimson liquid, promising vitality and earthy goodness. It was beetroot juice. The color, a deep, vibrant red, was undeniably reminiscent of the very substance he craved. It was, of course, a pale imitation, devoid of the warmth, the complex iron tang, the very life of true blood. But it was red, and it was liquid. And most importantly, it required no biting. He began his new dietary regimen with a meticulousness that bordered on ritualistic. He procured large quantities of the beetroot juice, pouring it into his finest crystal goblets, remnants salvaged from his castle, now incongruous in his humble abode. He would swirl the deep red liquid, holding it up to the dim glow of his modern lamps, pretending it possessed the rich viscosity of the real thing. He would sip it slowly, deliberately, allowing the earthy sweetness to coat his tongue, attempting to convince his ancient starved cells that this was indeed sustenance. The first sip was always a profound disappointment, a stark reminder of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the illusion and the agonizing reality. It tasted of soil, of root, of something stubbornly, unequivocally vegetable. But he persisted. He cultivated a pretense, a carefully constructed illusion of satisfaction, a performance for himself as much as for any unseen observer. He would close his eyes, imagining the rush, the warmth, the very essence of life flowing into him, even as the cold, sweet earthiness of the beetroot juice failed to ignite any such sensation. He would wipe a phantom dribble from his lip, as if he had just completed a glorious feast, rather than simply swallowed a beverage extracted from a common root. The rare steaks were a more challenging, yet equally essential component of his new diet. He discovered the butchers of this modern age offered cuts of meat so rare, so barely cooked, that a faint, tantalizing crimson still seeped from their fibers. He would select the reddest, the most blood-rich specimens, taking them home to his small, functional kitchen. There, with implements acquired from a bewildering array of shops, he would meticulously slice the raw or near-raw steak into minute, manageable pieces. Each morsel was carefully torn or cut into fragments, small enough to be swallowed whole, avoiding any painful pressure on his remaining sensitive fang, or the raw, exposed gum where its twin had once resided. He would chew with a careful, almost delicate motion, allowing the lingering warmth and the faint, metallic taste of the meat's residual blood to wash over his tongue. He would close his eyes then too, imagining the rich iron-laden liquid, convincing himself with every fiber of his immortal being that this meager offering was indeed the essence of life. It was a tedious, unfulfilling process, a parody of his former predatory glory, yet it was undeniably effective in staving off the worst of the gnawing hunger. He was a lion, meticulously picking at crumbs, but crumbs nonetheless. His coven, those insolent, mocking vampires who had relished his downfall with glasses of turnip juice, had initially continued their subtle derision. Whispers of Count Valerius' vegetarian face and the great carnivore's root cravings reached his ears, carried by his perpetually annoyed bat familiars who, sensing a shift in the wind, had returned to his domain with a renewed sense of cautious loyalty. But as the nights turned into weeks, and Vladislav, though gaunt and still perpetually pained, did not dissipate, did not wither, did not become the pathetic, starved husk they had perhaps hoped for, their mockery began to transform. They observed his new routine, his meticulous sourcing of beetroot, his careful preparation of rare steak. They watched as he would sip his crimson liquid with a feigned air of deep satisfaction, as he would delicately consume his morsels of meat, his eyes holding a strange, almost resolute glint. They saw that he was, however absurdly, surviving. And not just surviving, but adapting. His creativity, born of desperate necessity, was a testament to his ancient cunning, a display of resilience that even in its profound ridiculousness began to impress Lady Katarina. whose porcelain features usually expressed nothing but disdain, was the first to approach him, her eyes, though still sharp, holding a flicker of grudging admiration. "My lord," she purred, her voice devoid of its usual saccharine sarcasm, "we have observed your innovative approach to sustenance. It is resourceful, undeniably so, Lord Grigor." The hulking brute grunted in agreement. "We thought you lost, my lord, reduced to dust. But this is a new path. A path for those challenged by conventional means." His eyes, for once, did not hold amusement, but a strange, almost respectful contemplation. It was Elder Victor, the most pragmatic of his coven, who proposed the idea. "My lord," he stated, his ancient voice surprisingly clear, "your plight, while unique in its severity, is not entirely alien. The modern world presents many dietary complexities for our kind. The shrinking prey populations, the ever-vigilant mortals, the advent of certain medical advancements that render some blood unpalatable. Many among us struggle. They seek alternatives, but lack your ingenuity, your leadership." He paused, adjusting the folds of his ancient cloak. "We propose a gathering, a forum, a support group, as the mortals call it, for those vampires who are, shall we say, detarily challenged." Vladislav stared at them, a slow, incredulous realization dawning upon him. They were not mocking him. Not entirely, at least. They were genuinely impressed by his absurd solution, and saw in his desperation a new form of leadership, a path for their own increasingly complex existence. A support group for vampires who couldn't bite, or who struggled with specific blood types, or who found the modern world's fast food diets simply unpalatable. It was ludicrous, yet it made a strange, horrifying kind of sense. And so, the Nocturnal Nutritional Navigation and Adaptation Society, or as it was more commonly, if unofficially known, the Fanged Foodies Anonymous, was born. The meetings were held in a seldom-used antechamber of Vladislav's ancestral castle, still echoing with the ghosts of forgotten feasts. The attendees were a motley collection of vampires, some ancient and weary, others freshly turned and bewildered by their new existence. There was Bartholomew, a once fierce warrior now plagued by an extreme sensitivity to human blood from modern pharmaceutical contaminants, subsisting entirely on the blood of organic, free-range chickens. There was Countess Esmeralda, a vampire of exquisite taste, who simply could not stomach blood from anyone who had consumed processed sugars, a modern affliction she deemed utterly barbaric. And then there was Silas, a younger vampire who, in a tragic turn of events, had discovered he was severely lactose intolerant after inadvertently feeding on a milkman, and now suffered from perpetual stomach cramps. Vladislav, despite the persistent throb in his jaw and the hollow echo of his true hunger, found himself presiding over these gatherings with a strange, detached solemnity. He would sit at the head of a long, dusty table, sipping his beetroot juice from a crystal goblet, while recounting the virtues of its color and the subtle iron notes of rare steak. His coven members, once his tormentors, now listened with rapt attention, scribbling notes on parchment or, in the case of the more modern converts, on small, luminous tablets. The key, Vladislav would intone, his voice regaining some of its ancient authority, though laced with a pervasive weariness, is adaptation and pretense. You must believe in your new sustenance. You must convince your ancient, stubborn biology that beetroot juice is the vital essence, that rare steak is the very pulse of life. He would then demonstrate his elaborate, ritualistic sipping and chewing, a performance worthy of a grand opera, while internally his immortal stomach screamed for the real thing. The coven, far from mocking him now, seemed genuinely inspired. They shared their own dietary woes, their struggles with modern blood sources. their attempts to find palatable alternatives. Bartholomew would wax lyrical about the delicate nuances of chicken blood, while Esmeralda would debate the ethical implications of organic versus conventionally raised cattle. Silas, perpetually pale, would offer somber warnings about the dangers of dairy products. Vladislav, for his part, still yearned for the days of effortless predation, for the glorious rush of a true bite. His broken fang, though no longer a raw open wound, remained a constant dull ache, a phantom limb that constantly reminded him of his profound deficiency. But now, amidst the absurd discussions of dietary restrictions and the shared misery of their challenged existences, he found a strange, quiet camaraderie. He was no longer alone in his unique predicament. He was, ironically, a leader, guiding his coven through the baffling, increasingly bland landscape of modern vampiric nutrition. The moonlight, filtering through the grimy windows of his ancient castle, illuminated not a scene of terror, but a tableau of bewildered immortals, debating the merits of various juices and the proper preparation of overly rare meats. All under the weary, rare meats, all under the weary, yet strangely compassionate gaze of that toothless but surprisingly resourceful lord. His reign, it seemed, was not ending with a bang, nor a whimper, but with the clinking of beetroot juice glasses and the solemn pronouncements of a support group meeting. Chapter 11. The Legend of the Toothless Terror. The words of Dr. Alistair Finch, that unassuming, spectacled mortal, resonated within Count Vladislav Dracul with a peculiar, almost haunting clarity. Eternal tooth decay. It was a diagnosis, both preposterous and profoundly, undeniably accurate. It had stripped away the last, clinging vestiges of his ancient pride, but in doing so, it had also offered a strange, unsettling form of liberation. His torment, a personal, agonizing betrayal of his own immortal flesh, was not a sign of his impending doom or divine curse, but simply an immutable, eternal flaw in his very being. His fangs, those once magnificent instruments of terror, were destined to crumble from within, forever. The pain, though still a relentless, malevolent thrum in his jaw, no longer felt like a fleeting crisis to be overcome, but a permanent companion, a chronic, absurd burden. The sheer, overwhelming relief of being understood, even by a mortal, even for something so monumentally ridiculous, had been a balm unlike any potion or incantation. It was the first time in centuries he felt a quiet resignation, a strange acceptance of his fate, however ludicrous that fate might be. The blood bank debacle, that brightly lit tableau of his utter impotence, now seemed like a distant, albeit humiliating memory. The security guard's weary pity, the casual offer of a sandwich, still pricked at the raw edges of his dignity, but it no longer consumed him. He was a vampire, yes, but also a creature of adaptation, a survivor who had weathered plagues, wars, and the relentless march of human ingenuity for half a millennium. He could not bite. That was the unassailable truth. His remaining fang, while still technically present, felt like a brittle, useless ornament, its very sensitivity a cruel reminder of its broken counterpart. The primal, insatiable hunger, however, remained a cold, hollow ache in his gut, a constant, nagging demand for the vital essence that fueled his immortality. The small, carefully measured amounts of blood from his unwitting clients in his barber shop, while keeping him from complete dissipation, left him perpetually on the precipice of true, satisfying sustenance. He needed a new way, a new path, a diet. His peculiar new life as Master Valerio, the gentle barber surgeon, had, against all odds, stabilized. The beetroot juice and meticulously sliced rare steaks, while never truly sating the ancient hunger, kept him from wasting away. The Nocturnal Nutritional Navigation and Adaptation Society was thriving, a testament to his unlikely leadership in the face of modern dietary challenges for vampires. His coven, once contemptuous, now regarded him with a strange, almost academic respect, debating the merits of various animal blood sources and the nutritional value of different root vegetable extracts. The pain in his jaw, eternal tooth decay, as Dr. Finch so aptly put it, remained a constant dull companion, a low thrum beneath the surface of his peculiar existence. It was a familiar ache now, less a tormentor and more a persistent, if irritating, roommate. However, a new, unforeseen dimension began to manifest in his increasingly absurd existence. The mortals, those curious, adaptable creatures who had once cowered before his name, had begun to re-evaluate his presence. His initial, clumsy forays into modern society, the bungled hunt with the confused peasant, the humiliating incident at the blood bank where he was pitied rather than feared by the security guards, these had not been erased from local memory. Instead, they had mutated, warped by the fertile ground of rural folklore and the peculiar human penchant for turning the terrifying into the whimsical. The whispers began subtly. A child, perhaps, recounting a half-remembered tale of a gaunt, dark figure who limped through the woods clutching his jaw. A figure who looked less like a monster and more like a very sick old man. This story passed from whispered fear to hushed curiosity, began to intertwine with the existing legends of the Carpathian region, tales of ancient spirits, of forest guardians, of figures of power. But the Count, in his current dilapidated state, could not possibly be the fearsome impaler of yore. He was something else. Something odd. His nocturnal perambulations as Master Valario, seeking out fresh ingredients for his beetroot concoctions or visiting his few remaining, genuinely human barber clients, only solidified this evolving perception. He was seen, not lurking menacingly, but shuffling with a certain weary resignation, his gaunt face perpetually etched with a faint grimace that was interpreted not as malice, but as chronic discomfort. He was the dark, mysterious figure who kept to himself, whose shop smelled faintly of mint and old earth, and who, rumor had it, rarely spoke above a rasping whisper, because his teeth, poor man, gave him such dreadful bother. The turning point, perhaps, came with little Elara, daughter of blacksmith from a neighboring village. Elara, a child of vivid imagination and even more vivid nightmares, had been told tales of the dread vampire who resided in the crumbling castle, a creature with terrible fangs that could pierce the very soul. But Elara, having lost her first milk tooth, had also heard the whispers of the tooth ailment wanderer, the strange, pained man who limped through the moonlit forests. That night, with her tiny tooth nestled under her pillow, a spark of childish logic ignited in her mind. If the fearsome creature had problems with yeasty teeth, perhaps he understood the suffering of losing one. And if he understood, maybe he could help. She decided, with the unshakable conviction of a 7-year-old, that the tooth ailment wanderer was the perfect recipient for her lost incisor. She whispered her wish into the darkness, a plea for a new doll, then drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the milk tooth was gone, and a shiny, perfectly crafted wooden doll lay in its place. Elara shrieked with delight. Her parents, bewildered but pleased by their daughter's joy and the mysterious toy, dismissed it as a fanciful dream, or perhaps a particularly thoughtful forest spirit. But Elara knew. She, good. And children, with their boundless capacity for belief and their singular logic, listened. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the legend began to shift. The fearsome vampire, the bloodthirsty Count Draco, faded into the murky depths of adult nightmares. In his place, a new figure emerged in the children's lore, the Toothless Terror. He was still a creature of the night, still resided in the crumbling castle, but he was no longer a harbinger of dread. Instead, he was a silent, sorrowful entity, perpetually afflicted by his own dental woes, and thus uniquely empathetic to the discomfort of losing a tooth. He didn't bite, he collected. He didn't steal, he exchanged. And he, in his toothless wisdom, could grant wishes. Vladislav's first encounter with this new aspect of his evolving reputation was predictably bewildering. He found a small, carefully wrapped package on his ancient, dust-laden library table, placed there by an unseen hand. It was not a crucifix, nor a silver bullet. It was a tiny, pearly white milk tooth, wrapped in a scrap of faded blue ribbon. Beside it lay a folded, slightly smudged piece of parchment. Vladislav, his lone fang throbbing in phantom sympathy, picked it up with a trembling hand. The note, painstakingly written in a child's clumsy script, read, "Dear Mr. Toothless Terror, my tooth fell out. Please can my dog Barky stop limping? He misses chasing squirrels. From Lily." Vladislav stared at the tiny tooth, then at the earnest, innocent plea. A dog. Limping. Squirrels. This was the new face of his terror? He, who had once orchestrated the screams of entire villages, was now being asked for veterinary services for a squirrel-chasing canine. It was an absurdity of such monumental proportions that it almost made him forget the constant throb in his jaw. What was he to do with a milk tooth? He had no use for it. He possessed no means to heal a canine's limp, beyond perhaps draining it entirely, which seemed counterproductive to the child's wish. He dismissed it as a singular strange occurrence, a child's fanciful mistake. But the occurrences multiplied. Over the following weeks and then months he found more of them. Tiny teeth, tucked into crevices in his castle walls, left on his windowsills, sometimes even placed, with unnerving precision, directly on his sarcophagus. Each came with a small, earnest wish, for a lost kitten to return, for a bountiful harvest for their father, for a tyrannical schoolmaster to grow a tail. The sheer, relentless innocence of it all was more disarming than any armed militia. He was no longer a feared entity, but a sort of morbidly inclined fairy. He even found, on one particularly damp night, a small, crudely drawn picture of himself, looking remarkably well-fed and holding a tiny, glittering tooth taped to the cold stone of his castle gate. The artistic rendering was surprisingly kind, depicting him with an almost beatific expression, an absurdity that sent a fresh spasm of phantom pain through his jaw, not from agony, but from the sheer disbelief of it all. He, Vladislav Dracul, a benign, dental-fixated folk hero. The thought was enough to make his ancient, bloodless heart ache with ironic amusement. His coven, when they finally learned of this new development, reacted with a mixture of bewildered amusement and profound, if grudging, respect. Lady Katerina, typically so aloof, brought him a tiny, intricately carved wooden bird found on her window ledge alongside a minuscule molar. "My lord," she drawled, her voice a careful balance of irony and awe, "it seems your unique affliction has inspired a new form of worship. They offer you their very bones and their nascent hopes. A fascinating evolution of the predatory relationship, wouldn't you agree?" Lord Grigor, ever pragmatic, merely grunted, less chasing, more collecting. Efficient in its own way. "Though what you do with these offerings is beyond me." He eyed the pile of tiny teeth accumulating in a forgotten corner of the library with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, as if expecting them to suddenly animate and begin performing a miniature, saccharine dance. Elder Victor, however, saw a deeper, more profound implication. "My lord," he mused, stroking his ancient chin, "you have transmuted fear into something else. Not adoration, perhaps, but a peculiar form of trust. They believe you understand their pain. They come to you not for your fangs, but for their absence. This is adaptation, pushed to its logical, if utterly absurd, extreme. You are no longer just the toothless terror. You are the patron saint of lost dentition, perhaps. or the whispering wish-granter of the Carpathians, with a penchant for minty breath. He even offered a faint, almost paternal smile, a rare display of genuine warmth from the ancient vampire. The Coven had, by now, grown accustomed to the faint, lingering scent of mint that always seemed to emanate from their lord, a curious counterpoint to the ancient dust and cold stone of their castle. It was just another facet of his inexplicable modern transformation. Vladislav, presiding over his nocturnal nutritional navigation and adaptation society, would occasionally, almost involuntarily, run his tongue over the empty space in his gum. The children's wishes, so mundane and human, yet so deeply felt, resonated with a strange power. He had no magical abilities to grant bountiful harvests or reunite lost pets. His power lay in terror, in blood, in shadows. Yet he found himself on some quiet nights, after he had finished his carefully measured beetroot juice and painstakingly swallowed his rare steak slivers, contemplating these wishes. He might, on a whim, subtly influence a village dog to return home, or perhaps ensure a local farmer found a particularly good patch of mushrooms, or even, in the case of the tyrannical schoolmaster, cause an unfortunate series of minor, embarrassing incidents like an inexplicable allergy to chalk dust or a sudden, uncontrollable urge to recite nursery rhymes. Not out of benevolence, not entirely, but out of a strange, almost paternal obligation to the tiny offerings left on his castle sills. It was the least he could do for those who, through their sheer innocence and misinterpretation, had transformed his greatest humiliation into a bizarre new form of respect. His reign of terror, once etched in blood and fear, had subtly, irrevocably morphed. He was no longer the creature that haunted nightmares, but a perplexing figure in local folklore, a guardian of tiny teeth and whispered hopes. He was the Toothless Terror, a vampire who couldn't bite, who consumed beetroot juice and raw steak, and who, in his most private moments, pondered the whereabouts of lost puppies and the best methods for a schoolmaster to grow a tail. The absurdity of his existence, once a source of torment, had become a quiet, ongoing, darkly humorous drama. The moonlight, filtering through the ancient, dusty windows of his castle, illuminated a creature not of pure malevolence, but of profound irony, forever bound by the unexpected consequences of an eternal toothache. The silence of the night was no longer filled with the screams of his victims, but with the quiet contemplation of children's wishes and the subtle, incessant thrum of his own uniquely immortal dental pain, a constant reminder of the bizarre legend he had inadvertently become. Chapter 12. The final bite, the words of Dr. Alistair Finch, that unassuming, spectacled mortal, resonated within Count Vladislav Dracul with a peculiar, almost haunting clarity. Eternal tooth decay. It was a diagnosis, both preposterous and profoundly, undeniably accurate. It had stripped away the last, clinging vestiges of his ancient pride, but in doing so, it had also offered a strange, unsettling form of liberation. His torment, a personal, agonizing betrayal of his own immortal flesh, was not a sign of his impending doom or divine curse, but simply an immutable, eternal flaw in his very being. His fangs, those once magnificent instruments of terror, were destined to crumble from within forever. The pain, though still a relentless, malevolent thrum in his jaw, no longer felt like a fleeting crisis to be overcome, but a permanent companion, a chronic, absurd burden. The sheer, overwhelming relief of being understood even by a mortal, even for something so monumentally ridiculous, had been a balm unlike any potion or incantation. It was the first time in centuries he felt a quiet resignation, a strange acceptance of his fate, however ludicrous that fate might be. The blood bank debacle, that brightly lit tableau of his utter impotence, now seemed like a distant, albeit humiliating, memory. The security guard's weary pity, the casual offer of a sandwich, still pricked at the raw edges of his dignity, but it no longer consumed him. He was a vampire, yes, but also a creature of adaptation, a survivor who had weathered plagues, wars, and the relentless march of human ingenuity for half a millennium. He could not bite. That was the unassailable truth. His remaining fang, while still technically present, felt like a brittle, useless ornament, its very sensitivity a cruel reminder of its broken counterpart. The primal, insatiable hunger, however, remained a cold, hollow ache in his gut, a constant nagging demand for the vital essence that fueled his immortality. The small, carefully measured amounts of blood from his unwitting clients in his barber shop, while keeping him from complete dissipation, left him perpetually on the precipice of true, satisfying sustenance. He had accepted his new diet of beetroot juice, and painstakingly sliced rare steaks, which, while sustaining him, left a void that no amount of earthy sweetness or metallic tang could ever truly fill. His peculiar new life as Master Valerio, the gentle barber surgeon, had, against all odds, stabilized. The beetroot juice and meticulously sliced rare steaks, while never truly sating the ancient hunger, kept him from wasting away. The Nocturnal Nutritional Navigation and Adaptation Society was thriving, a testament to his unlikely leadership in the face of modern dietary challenges for vampires. His coven, once contemptuous, now regarded him with a strange, almost academic respect, debating the merits of various animal blood sources and the nutritional value of different root vegetable extracts. The pain in his jaw, eternal tooth decay as Dr. Finch so aptly put it, remained a constant, dull companion, a low thrum beneath the surface of his peculiar existence. It was a familiar ache now, less a tormentor and more a persistent, if irritating, roommate. And then there were the children. The local mortals, in their inscrutable way, had transformed him, Vladislav Dracul, into the Toothless Terror. A benevolent, albeit somber, collector of milk teeth, and a reluctant granter of wishes. He still found the tiny pearly offerings on his castle sills, under his sarcophagus, sometimes even nestled in his slippers. He would read the earnest, scribbled notes. "Please make my cat stop scratching the curtains, or I wish for a new pair of boots." He would sometimes, in his odd, new role, subtly influence a particularly troublesome cat to find a new scratching post, or perhaps direct a local cobbler to inadvertently create a particularly sturdy pair of children's boots. It was a strange, silent pact, testament to the utterly bizarre turn his eternal life had taken. He was no longer a predator, but a patron saint of minor domestic woes and lost baby teeth, a cosmic absurdity that still, occasionally, made his sole remaining fang throb with a phantom ache that felt suspiciously like ironic amusement. Yet, despite this newfound, peculiar tranquility, a deep, resonant emptiness persisted within him. It was not merely the physical craving for blood, for that he could manage, however unsatisfyingly. It was the yearning for the octai itself, the assertion of his vampiric nature, the piercing, the intimate, primal connection to life, however fleetingly. His soul, ancient and weary, felt brittle, chipped away not by holy water or sunlight, but by the relentless, grinding indignity of his dental incapacity. He was a vampire who could not bite, and that, he realized, was a profound spiritual mutilation, far more damaging than any physical wound. His dignity, that invisible cloak of ancient power and fearsome reputation, was threadbare, patched with beetroot juice and the whispered wishes of children. He yearned for one last, true assertion of his being, a single unadulterated moment where he could reclaim, however fleetingly, the essence of what he was. He contemplated his coven, Lady Katarina, Lord Grigor, and especially Elder Victor, who had, against all odds, shown a surprising understanding of his profound, dental-rooted crisis. It was to Elder Victor that Vladislav finally turned. Victor, oldest and most pragmatic of his remaining followers, possessed a quiet loyalty that transcended the shift in Vladislav's power. He was not prone to overt displays of emotion, but his wisdom and calm demeanor often brought a quiet sanity to the chaos of immortal life. One cold, desolate night, after a particularly spirited and frankly baffling discussion in the Nocturnal Nutritional Navigation and Adaptation Society about the merits of pasteurized versus unpasteurized animal blood, Vladislav beckoned Elder Victor to his private chambers. The chamber, once a den of fear and command, now simply felt cold and dusty, illuminated by a single flickering gas lamp. "Victor," Vladislav rasped, his voice barely a whisper, the dull ache in his jaw a constant companion. "I require a favor, a personal matter, one of profound existential weight." Elder Victor, a tall, gaunt figure draped in ancient dark robes, merely inclined his head. His eyes, dark and knowing, held a rare hint of solemnity. "My lord, you have but to ask. Your struggles have taught us all a great deal about adaptation in these trying times. We are, after all, a family, however dysfunctional." He even managed a faint, almost sympathetic smile. Vladislav hesitated, the words feeling alien, almost blasphemous on his tongue. He, the impaler, asking for such a thing? I yearn for the touch, the assertion, the acti. He waved a trembling, clawed hand towards his mouth, towards the gaping void where his fang had been, and then to his remaining, sensitive canine. "My purpose, it is diminished, my essence hollowed. I wish to bite, one last time, a true bite, not for sustenance, not for hunger, but for dignity, for memory, for the very core of my being." Elder Victor regarded him for a long, silent moment, his ancient eyes piercing. He understood. He had witnessed centuries of Vladislav's reign, his undisputed dominance, his fearsome prowess. He had seen the slow, agonizing decline, brought about not by a hero's blade, but by a wretched, mundane toothache. He knew the profound spiritual wound that this physical incapacitation had inflicted. "You seek not nourishment, my lord," Victor mused, his voice low, "but communion, a reassertion of your true nature in the face of its forced denial." He paused, then slowly, deliberately, pushed back the collar of his ancient robe, exposing a slender, pale neck. The skin was almost translucent, crisscrossed with faint ancient scars, a testament to countless battles and perhaps countless less willing feedings in centuries past. "Very well, my lord. I offer myself, not as a victim, but as a loyal friend, a vessel for your reclamation." Vladislav stared at the exposed throat, the faint pulse fluttering beneath the papery skin. His senses, though dulled, flared with a ghost of their former intensity. The faint, sweet aroma of Victor's ancient, ethereal blood mingled with the scent of dust and aged parchment. A wave of profound, almost unbearable longing washed over him, but beneath it another wave. A deep, aching sadness for what was lost. This was not the thrill of the hunt, the terror of the unsuspecting victim, the glorious rush of primal release. This was a quiet, solemn, almost pathetic ritual. He moved slowly, deliberately, his every motion a testament to his weariness and the fragility of his remaining dignity. He raised a trembling hand, not to seize, but to gently cup Victor's jaw, guiding the older vampire's head to present the vulnerable angle of his throat. His remaining fang extended, a single lonely spear point, quivering slightly with the effort. He leaned in, his mouth open, focusing every ounce of his ancient will, every lingering shred of his predatory instinct, on the single, precise point where his fang was meant to strike. But the pain, that eternal, unrelenting pain, surged. A white-hot agony flared from the root of his sole remaining fang, shooting through his skull like a bolt of lightning. His vision swam, a kaleidoscope of pain and despair. His body tensed, an involuntary tremor running through his gaunt frame. His jaw, perpetually inflamed and sensitive, rebelled, muscles spasming, refusing the full, decisive motion. Instead of piercing, instead of sinking, his fang merely scraped, a pathetic, almost comical brush against Victor's ancient, resilient skin. There was no clean bite, no satisfying puncture, no rush of liquid warmth. There was only a faint, almost imperceptible wee scraping, followed by a soft, squishy kunding as his gums, raw and sensitive from weeks of painful gnawing, and the residual trauma of his broken tooth, made contact. It was not a bite. It was a gum nibble. A pathetic, toothless gnawing against skin. A tiny bead of crimson, no larger than a dewdrop, welled up on Victor's pale throat, smeared by the clumsy, painful pressure of Ladislav's throbbing gum. It was not a gush, not a fountain, not even a trickle. It was a single, solitary bead, born more of abrasion than penetration. Vladislav recoiled, his face contorted not in pleasure, but in a mixture of pain and profound, shattering humiliation. His tongue, exploring the meager contact, tasted nothing. The blood, so close yet so utterly inaccessible, mocked him. Elder Victor, for his part, remained still, his eyes closed. He felt the faint, almost ticklish sensation of the gumming, the pathetic scrape of the single fang. He felt the minute, almost negligible moisture of the single bead of blood. There was no pain, no discomfort beyond the slight pressure. He opened his eyes, meeting Vladislav's. He saw the profound agony in his lord's gaze, the shame, the bitter disappointment. He understood the monumental effort that had gone into that pathetic non-bite. "My lord," Victor murmured, his voice gentle, devoid of judgment. It was sufficient. Vladislav stared at him, his mouth still aching, his stomach still hollow. Sufficient? It was a travesty, a monumental failure. Yet, as he looked at Victor's unwavering gaze, at the single bead of blood on his neck, at the quiet, profound understanding in his ancient eyes, a strange, unexpected shift occurred within him. He had itrading. He had pushed through the pain, through the indignity, through the crippling limitation. He had, in his own tragically pathetic way, performed the ritual. He had asserted his vampire nature, not with strength, but with sheer, stubborn will. The hunger in his gut remained, a cold, empty void. He had consumed nothing, but something else had been sated. His spirit, battered and bruised for weeks by the constant erosion of his identity, felt a strange, quiet swell. It was not the roaring satisfaction of a full feast, but a faint, ethereal whisper of completeness. He had faced his greatest humiliation head-on, in front of a loyal friend, and had, however clumsily, completed the symbolic act. He was still the vampire, even if a broken, gumming one. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through Vladislav's ancient frame. It was a tremor not of cold, nor of pain, but of a quiet, bittersweet triumph. He had plumbed the depths of absurdity, lost his fangs, been reduced to a barber, a beetroot enthusiast, a collector of milk teeth. And yet he had, in this pathetic, almost tender act, reclaimed a sliver of his shattered dignity. He was a vampire, a toothless, aching, perpetually hungry, yet undeniably still a vampire. He nodded slowly, a profound, weary acceptance settling over him. "Indeed, Victor," he rasped, the words feeling heavy with centuries of experience and the weight of his new reality. "Sufficient." He turned from the elder, leaving the single bead of blood on his throat, a testament to the most unusual, most pathetic, and yet most profound bite of his long absurd existence. He walked back to his sarcophagus, the dull throb in his jaw familiar, almost comforting companion now. The moonlight streamed through the ancient grimy windows of his castle, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, casting long, silent shadows. He was Vladislav Dracul, Lord of the Night, the Impaler. Now merely a very old, very tired vampire, content, in his own strange way, with a final, pathetic gum nibble that had, against all odds, healed something far deeper than hunger. The world would continue to churn, full of its baffling modernities and its simple human woes, and he, the Toothless Terror, would continue to exist, a living, breathing testament to the resilience of an immortal and the enduring absurdity of a truly monumental toothache. Chapter 12. The final bite, the words of Dr. Alistair Finch, that unassuming, spectacled mortal, resonated within Count Vladislav Dracul with a peculiar, almost haunting clarity. Eternal tooth decay. It was a diagnosis both preposterous and profoundly, undeniably accurate. It had stripped away the last, clinging vestiges of his ancient pride, but in doing so, it had also offered a strange, unsettling form of liberation. His torment, a personal, agonizing betrayal of his own immortal flesh, was not a sign of his impending doom or divine curse, but simply an immutable, eternal flaw in his very being. His fangs, those once magnificent instruments of terror, were destined to crumble from within forever. The pain, though still a relentless, malevolent thrum in his jaw, no longer felt like a fleeting crisis to be overcome, but a permanent companion, a chronic, absurd burden. The sheer, overwhelming relief of being understood in, even by a mortal, even for something so monumentally ridiculous, had been a balm unlike any potion or incantation. It was the first time in centuries he felt a quiet resignation, a strange acceptance of his fate, however ludicrous that fate might be. The blood bank debacle, that brightly lit tableau of his utter impotence, now seemed like a distant, albeit humiliating, memory. The security guard's weary pity, the casual offer of a sandwich, still pricked at the raw edges of his dignity, but it no longer consumed him. He was a vampire, yes, but also a creature of adaptation, a survivor who had weathered plagues, wars, and the relentless march of human ingenuity for half a millennium. He could not bite. That was the unassailable truth. His remaining fang, while still technically present, felt like a brittle, useless ornament, its very sensitivity a cruel reminder of its broken counterpart. The primal, insatiable hunger, however, remained a cold, hollow ache in his gut, a constant nagging demand for the vital essence that fueled his immortality. The small, carefully measured amounts of blood from his unwitting clients in his barber shop, while keeping him from complete dissipation, left him perpetually on the precipice of true, satisfying sustenance. He had accepted his new diet of beetroot juice and painstakingly sliced rare steaks, which, while sustaining him, left a void that no amount of earthy sweetness or metallic tang could ever truly fill. His peculiar new life as Master Valerio, the gentle barber surgeon, had against all odds stabilized. The beetroot juice and meticulously sliced rare steaks, while never truly sating the ancient hunger, kept him from wasting away. The Nocturnal Nutritional Navigation and Adaptation Society was thriving, a testament to his unlikely leadership in the face of modern dietary challenges for vampires. His coven, once contemptuous, now regarded him with a strange, almost academic respect, debating the merits of various animal blood sources and the nutritional value of different root, vegetable extracts. The pain in his jaw, eternal tooth decay, as Dr. Finch so aptly put it, remained a constant, dull companion, a low thrum beneath the surface of his peculiar existence. It was a familiar ache now, less a tormentor and more a persistent, if irritating, roommate. And then there were the children. The local mortals, in their inscrutable way, had transformed him Vladislav Dracul into the Toothless terror, a benevolent, albeit somber, collector of milk teeth, and a reluctant granter of wishes. He still found the tiny pearly offerings on his castle sills, under his sarcophagus, sometimes even nestled in his slippers. He would read the earnest, scribbled notes. "Please make my cat stop scratching the curtains, or I wish for a new pair of boots." He would sometimes, in his odd, new role, subtly influence a particularly troublesome cat to find a new scratching post, or perhaps direct a local cobbler to inadvertently create a particularly sturdy pair of children's boots. It was a strange, silent pact, a testament to the utterly bizarre turn his eternal life had taken. He was no longer a predator, but a patron saint of minor domestic woes and lost baby teeth, a cosmic absurdity that still, occasionally, made his soul-remaining Fang throb with a phantom ache that felt suspiciously like ironic amusement. Yet despite this newfound, peculiar tranquility, a deep, resonant emptiness persisted within him. It was not merely the physical craving for blood. For that he could manage, however unsatisfyingly. It was the yearning for the Hakte itself, the assertion of his vampiric nature, the piercing, the intimate, primal connection to life, however fleetingly. His soul, ancient and weary, felt brittle, chipped away not by holy water or sunlight, but by the relentless, grinding indignity of his dental incapacity. He was a vampire who could not bite, and that, he realized, was a profound spiritual mutilation, far more damaging than any physical wound. His dignity, that invisible cloak of ancient power and fearsome reputation, was threadbare, patched with beetroot juice and the whispered wishes of children. He yearned for one last, true assertion of his being, a single, unadulterated moment where he could reclaim, however fleetingly, the essence of what he was. He contemplated his coven, Lady Katarina, Lord Grigor, and especially Elder Victor, who had against all odds shown a surprising understanding of his profound, dental-rooted crisis. It was to Elder Victor that Vladislav finally turned. Victor, oldest and most pragmatic of his remaining followers, possessed a quiet loyalty that transcended the shift in Vladislav's power. He was not prone to overt displays of emotion, but his wisdom and calm demeanor often brought a quiet sanity to the chaos of immortal life. One cold, desolate night, after a particularly spirited and frankly baffling discussion in the Nocturnal Nutritional Navigation and Adaptation Society about the merits of pasteurized versus unpasteurized animal blood, Vladislav beckoned Elder Victor to his private chambers. The chamber, once a den of fear and command, now simply felt cold and dusty, illuminated by a single flickering gas lamp. "Victor," Vladislav rasped, his voice barely a whisper, the dull ache in his jaw a constant companion. "I require a favor, a personal matter, one of profound existential weight." Elder Victor, a tall, gaunt figure draped in ancient dark robes, merely inclined his head. His eyes, dark and knowing, held a rare hint of solemnity. "My lord, you have but to ask. Your struggles have taught us all a great deal about adaptation in these trying times. We are, after all, a family, however dysfunctional." He even managed a faint, almost sympathetic smile. Vladislav hesitated, the words feeling alien, almost blasphemous on his tongue. He, the impaler, asking for such a thing. I yearn for the touch, the assertion, the acte." He waved a trembling, clawed hand towards his mouth, towards the gaping void where his fang had been, and then to his remaining sensitive canine. "My purpose, it is diminished. My essence hollowed. I wish to bite one last time. A true bite. Not for sustenance, not for hunger, but for dignity, for memory, for the very core of my being. Elder Victor regarded him for a long, silent moment, his ancient eyes piercing. He understood. He had witnessed centuries of Vladislav's reign, his undisputed dominance, his fearsome prowess. He had seen the slow, agonizing decline brought about not by a hero's blade, but by a wretched mundane toothache. He knew the profound spiritual wound that this physical incapacitation had inflicted. "You seek not nourishment, my lord," Victor mused, his voice low, "but communion, a reassertion of your true nature in the face of its forced denial." He paused, then slowly, deliberately, pushed back the collar of his ancient robe, exposing a slender pale neck. The skin was almost translucent, crisscrossed with faint ancient scars, a testament to countless battles, and perhaps countless less willing feedings in centuries past. "Very well, my lord. I offer myself, not as a victim, but as a loyal friend, a vessel for your reclamation." Vladislav stared at the exposed throat, the faint pulse fluttering beneath the papery skin. His senses, though dulled, flared with a ghost of their former intensity. The faint, sweet aroma of Victor's ancient, ethereal blood mingled with the scent of dust and aged parchment. A wave of profound, almost unbearable longing washed over him. But beneath it another wave, a deep, aching sadness for what was lost. This was not the thrill of the hunt, the terror of the unsuspecting victim, the glorious rush of primal release. This was a quiet, solemn, almost pathetic ritual. He moved slowly, deliberately, his every motion a testament to his weariness and the fragility of his remaining dignity. He raised a trembling hand, not to seize, but to gently cup Victor's jaw, guiding the older vampire's head to present the vulnerable angle of his throat. His remaining fang extended, a single lonely spear point, quivering slightly with the effort. He leaned in, his mouth open, focusing every ounce of his ancient will, every lingering shred of his predatory instinct, on the single precise point where his fang was meant to strike. But the pain, that eternal, unrelenting pain, surged. A white-hot agony flared from the root of his sole remaining fang, shooting through his skull like a bolt of lightning. His vision swam, a kaleidoscope of pain and despair. His body tensed, an involuntary tremor running through his gaunt frame. His jaw, perpetually inflamed and sensitive, rebelled, muscles spasming, refusing the full, decisive motion. Instead of piercing, instead of sinking, his fang merely scraped a pathetic, almost comical brush against Victor's ancient, resilient skin. There was no clean bite, no satisfying puncture, no rush of liquid warmth. There was only a faint, almost imperceptible "Why-pay-him," followed by a soft, squishy glinting as his gums. Raw and sensitive from weeks of painful gnawing and the residual trauma of his broken tooth, made contact. It was not a bite. It was a gum nibble. A pathetic, toothless gnawing against skin. A tiny bead of crimson, no larger than a dewdrop, welled up on Victor's pale throat, smeared by the clumsy, painful pressure of Vladislav's throbbing gum. It was not a gush, not a fountain, not even a trickle. It was a single, solitary bead, born more of abrasion than penetration. Vladislav recoiled, his face contorted not in pleasure, but in a mixture of pain and profound, shattering humiliation. His tongue, exploring the meager contact, tasted nothing. The blood, so close yet so utterly inaccessible, mocked him. Elder Victor, for his part, remained still, his eyes closed. He felt the faint, almost ticklish sensation of the gumming, the pathetic scrape of the single fang. He felt the minute, almost negligible moisture of the single bead of blood. There was no pain, no discomfort beyond the slight pressure. He opened his eyes, meeting Vladislav's. He saw the profound agony in his lord's gaze, the shame, the bitter disappointment. He understood the monumental effort, that had gone into that pathetic non-bite. "My lord," Victor murmured, his voice gentle, devoid of judgment. "It was sufficient." Vladislav stared at him, his mouth still aching, his stomach still hollow. Sufficient? It was a travesty, a monumental failure. Yet, as he looked at Victor's unwavering gaze, at the single bead of blood on his neck, at the quiet, profound understanding in his ancient eyes, a strange, unexpected shift occurred within him. He had itch-ridding. He had pushed through the pain, through the indignity, through the crippling limitation. He had, in his own tragically pathetic way, performed the ritual. He had asserted his vampire nature, not with strength, but with sheer, stubborn will. The hunger in his gut remained, a cold, empty void. He had consumed nothing. But something else had been sated. His spirit, battered and bruised for weeks by the constant erosion of his identity, felt a strange, quiet swell. It was not the roaring satisfaction of a full feast, but a faint, ethereal whisper of completeness. He had faced his greatest humiliation head-on, in front of a loyal friend, and had, however clumsily, completed the symbolic act. He was still the vampire, even if a broken, gumming one. He nodded slowly, a profound, weary acceptance settling over him. "Indeed, Victor," he rasped, the words feeling heavy with centuries of experience and the weight of his new reality. "Insufficient." He turned from the elder, leaving the single bead of blood on his throat, a testament to the most unusual, most pathetic, and yet most profound bite of his long, absurd existence. He walked back to his sarcophagus, the dull throb in his jaw a familiar, almost comforting companion now. The moonlight streamed through the ancient, grimy windows of his castle, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, casting long, silent shadows. He was Vladislav Dracul, Lord of the Night, the Impaler, now merely a very old, very tired vampire, content, in his own strange way, with a final, pathetic gum nibble that had, against all odds, healed something far deeper than hunger. The world would continue to churn, full of its baffling modernities and its simple human woes, and he, the toothless terror, would continue to exist, a living, breathing testament to the resilience of an immortal and the enduring absurdity of a truly monumental toothache. Chapter 13. The vampire's retirement, the bittersweet aftermath of what Elder Victor had so charitably termed sufficient, settled upon Count Vladislav Dracul like a cloak spun from quiet resignation. The faint, almost imperceptible V2D of his gums against Victor's neck, the single bead of blood had not sated his hunger, but it had, in some profound and unexpected way, restored a fractured sliver of his dignity. It was the acknowledgment he craved, a final symbolic assertion of his nature, however clumsily executed. His eternal tooth decay, the relentless ache in his jaw, remained, of course. It was an immutable constant, a low, persistent thrum beneath the surface of his existence. But it no longer held the power to shatter his spirit. He had accepted it, embraced its absurdity, and in doing so, found a peculiar, if sardonic, peace. His days as Master Valeriu, the gentle barber surgeon, slowly dwindled. The necessity for the small, carefully measured blood extractions lessened as his spirit, ironically, began to find a different kind of sustenance in the quietude of his contemplation. The Nocturnal Nutritional Navigation and Adaptation Society continued to meet, though Vladislav's attendance became less about desperate self-preservation and more about a detached, almost avuncular interest in the dietary woes of his fellow undead. He would offer sage, if often ironic, advice on the merits of organic chicken blood, or the perils of sugar-laden human diets, sipping his beetroot juice with a newfound, genuine calm that bordered on contentment. His coven, in turn, revered him not for his fearsome power, which was now a quaint historical footnote, but for his profound adaptability, his strange resilience, and his almost comical wisdom in the face of immortal absurdity. They looked to him not for leadership in conquest, but for guidance in navigating the bewildering nuances of a prolonged, somewhat inconvenient, undeath. The children, too, continued their peculiar offerings. Tiny milk teeth, accompanied by earnest wishes for lost pets or an end to annoying siblings, still appeared on his castle sills. He continued to grant them, in his own subtle, indirect way, a curious testament to his evolving legend as the Toothless Terror, the benevolent, if slightly grim, collector of discarded dentition. He found a strange, unexpected joy in these small acts, a quiet satisfaction in influencing the mundane lives of mortals, no longer through terror, but through whimsy. His ancient, bloodless heart, once cold and unmoving, felt a faint, almost imperceptible warmth from these innocent interactions, a peculiar echo of human connection. It was in this newfound state of resigned tranquility that Count Vladislav Dracul, Lord of the Night, the Impaler, decided to retire. Not to dust, not to oblivion, but to a quieter, more contemplative existence. He relinquished the direct day-to-day governance of his castle to Elder Victor, who, with characteristic pragmatism, streamlined the affairs of the Coven, ensuring a steady, if bland, supply of beetroot juice and thinly sliced rare steaks for his aged lord, Lady Katarina, and Lord Grigor, once his mocking tormentors, now formed the backbone of the Fang Foodies Anonymous, overseeing meetings with a zealousness that bordered on fanatical, often quoting Vladislav's earlier pronouncements on the virtues of mock-blood beverages. Vladislav retreated to a smaller, more intimate corner of his vast, crumbling castle. He chose a crypt, not the grand, echoing chamber of his primary sarcophagus, but a smaller, cozier niche hidden behind a forgotten tapestry. It was surprisingly comfortable, lined with ancient, moth-eaten velvet, and surprisingly free of rats, which seemed to sense his new, non-threatening aura. Here, amidst the quietude of stone and shadow, he found his true calling, that of a chronicler. He began to write his memoirs. He had centuries of experiences, of conquests, of betrayals, of grand battles and chilling impalements. But those stories, he realized, felt strangely hollow now. The true drama, the profound absurdity of his eternal existence, lay in the relentless gnawing of a single tooth. And so, with a quill salvaged from a forgotten scribe's desk, and parchment liberated from dusty archives, he began to set down his tale. He titled it, with a wry, self-deprecating humor that would have shocked his former victims, A Confessions of a Gumming Ghoul, a memoir of immortal affliction and unexpected enlightenment. The writing process was a peculiar blend of agony and catharsis. He recounted his initial descent into dental torment with vivid, excruciating detail, the phantom pains flaring to life with each remembered throb. He wrote of Master Elara's crude pliers with a shudder, of Ananya's batwing and mint concoction with a dry, knowing chuckle. The encounter with Bogdan and his apple was depicted as a pivotal moment of bewildering kindness, while the blood bank heist was a darkly comedic tragedy, ending with the ignominious offer of a sandwich. He poured centuries of suppressed frustration, humiliation, and bewilderment onto the page, transforming his suffering into a narrative of absurd resilience. His prose, once sharp and commanding, became imbued with a new tone, a soothing, almost hypnotic rhythm, punctuated by moments of ironic observation and introspective humor. It was, he realized, precisely the kind of tale that would gently distract a restless mind, a long, meandering account of a very specific and very silly problem. He wrote tirelessly, night after night, his solitary remaining fang throbbing in rhythmic counterpoint to the scratching of his quill. He found a profound peace in the act of creation, in shaping the chaotic tapestry of his dental woes into a coherent, if utterly preposterous, narrative. The physical pain, though ever present, seemed to recede into the background. a dull murmur compared to the vibrant inner life of his memories and observations. He was no longer solely consumed by the ache. He was consumed by the telling of it. But his literary ambitions did not stop there. In a truly baffling twist, Vladislav, with the help of a younger, tech-savvy vampire who had joined the Fanged Foodies Anonymous and held a surprising affinity for human electronics, ventured into the digital realm. He started a blog. He called it, with a flourish of his now surprisingly steady hand, The Immortal Smile, a guide to undead oral hygiene and nutritional adaptation. His first post, titled Beyond the Bite, Navigating the Modern Undead Diet in a Post-Fang World, quickly gained a cult following among the more internet-inclined members of his own coven, and inexplicably, a small niche community of human dental hygienists who stumbled upon it, mistaking its ancient formal prose and peculiar subject matter for highly abstract, avant-garde poetry. He offered practical tips, derived from his own bitter experience, on the preservation of remaining dentition, a treatise against the consumption of crystallized sugars and the perils of impromptu tooth extraction with blacksmith's tools. Turnip nectar, a comparative analysis of non-coagulant liquid sustenance for the dietarily challenged immortal, mining minty freshness in the face of eternal decay, an exploration of herbal remedies and why some may be less effective than others, especially if they involve garlic. He even included a regular feature, Whispers from the Crypt, reader submissions on peculiar undead ailments, where he would, with surprising empathy, address the various bizarre complaints of his fellow vampires, from chronic cough and squeak to the psychological toll of a perpetual aversion to sunlight. His advice, though dry and often laced with his characteristic irony, was always practical, always rooted in his own absurd, hard-won wisdom. Vladislav Dracul, Lord of the Night, the Impaler, had found his true retirement. He was no longer defined by his lost fangs or his gnawing hunger, but by his quiet contemplation, his sardonic memoirs, and his surprisingly popular blog. His crypt, once a place of somber repose, now hummed faintly with the quiet tapping of his ancient fingers on a surprisingly modern keyboard, and the rustle of turning pages. The pain in his jaw was a constant, dual companion, a familiar friend in his twilight years, a quiet reminder of the bizarre journey that had led him here. He was at peace, in his own strange way, a retired terror, a gumming ghoul, a dental sage for the undead, finding a peculiar fulfillment in the unexpected and utterly absurd chapters of his immortal life. The moon, peering through the small grimy window of his cozy crypt, illuminated a scene not of fear, but of profound, quiet, and endlessly humorous serenity.